Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. The steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows lulled Sarah into a false sense of calm as she drove down the winding road. The headlights of her old car cut through the mist hanging over the forested hills, illuminating the occasional sign pointing her toward Hollow Pines Lake. It wasn't her first choice for a getaway, but solitude was what she needed now. After the breakup, the endless arguments, and the suffocating pace of city life, her friend Claire had insisted that a weekend by the lake would be the perfect way to clear her mind. "It's beautiful this time of year," Claire had said. "Quiet, peaceful. You can reset there." But as Sarah's car crested the final hill and the lake came into view, her chest tightened with unease. The water stretched out like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the darkened clouds above. Towering pines lined the shore, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers in the wind. The small cabin Claire had rented for her sat at the lake's edge, a lonely structure dwarfed by the imposing landscape. Something about the scene made Sarah's stomach knot, but she brushed the feeling aside. She was just tired. The cabin's interior was modest and cozy, with rustic furniture and a fireplace in the corner. Sarah dropped her bags and set about settling in, lighting the fireplace and pulling out the book she'd been meaning to read for months. She'd come here for peace, and she wasn't going to let her overactive imagination ruin it. As the hours ticked by, the rain intensified, a steady downpour that drowned out the world outside. The cabin creaked softly, the wood expanding and contracting with the storm's chill. Sarah tried to focus on her book, but the words blurred on the page. Her gaze drifted to the window. The lake was still visible through the rain, its surface rippling with each drop. But something caught her eye, a shadow beneath the water, large and slow-moving. She leaned closer to the window, squinting to make out the shape. The shadow paused, then disappeared into the depths. Sarah shook her head. "Probably just a fish," she muttered to herself, though her voice wavered. She pulled the curtains shut, determined to ignore the strange unease creeping into her thoughts. The night deepened, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Sarah lay in bed, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. Sleep came in fits, broken by the occasional creak of the cabin or the distant howl of the wind. At some point during the night, she woke suddenly, her heart racing. Something had pulled her from sleep, though she couldn't say what. She lay still, straining to hear over the storm. And then she heard it, a splash. It wasn't the sound of rain hitting the water. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something or someone had stepped into the lake. Sarah sat up, her pulse quickening. She peered toward the window, but the curtains were still drawn. Another splash echoed, louder this time. Her mind raced. Was someone outside? A fisherman, maybe? A lost hiker? Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed and moved to the window. With trembling hands, she pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The lake was still, its surface rippling faintly in the rain. There was no sign of anyone. She let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at her paranoia. But just as she turned away, she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the water. It was barely visible in the darkness, its outline shrouded in the storm. Tall, unmoving, its head tilted slightly as if it were looking directly at her. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It stood there, a black silhouette against the churning water. And then it took a step forward, toward the cabin. Sarah stumbled back, the curtain falling shut. Her mind raced. What was it? A person? An animal? She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, but there was no signal. No way to call for help. The sound of footsteps sloshing through the wet grass reached her ears, slow and deliberate. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the window, her eyes darting toward the door. The footsteps stopped, and then came a knock. Soft, almost polite. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her instincts screamed at her not to answer, to stay hidden, but she couldn't help herself. She moved slowly to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. Her hand hovered over the lock, debating whether to open the door, when she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, coming from just outside. Come to the water. Her stomach twisted with fear. She stumbled back from the door, her hands trembling. The whisper came again, this time louder, as if multiple voices were overlapping. Come to the water. The words echoed through the cabin, seeming to seep into the very walls. Sarah clutched her phone, her mind racing for a plan. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. Throwing on a jacket, she grabbed her keys and bolted for the back door. As she stepped outside, the cold rain hit her like a wall, but she didn't care. She ran toward her car, her shoes sinking into the muddy ground. But as she reached the car, she froze. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road. Its face was obscured, its body unnaturally still despite the howling wind. And then it began to move. Not walking, but gliding, its feet never touching the ground. It closed the distance between them in seconds, and as it did, Sarah finally saw its face, or what was left of it. The features were twisted, waterlogged, and decayed, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of the lake. Its eyes, black and lifeless, bore into hers. Sarah screamed, turning to run back to the cabin, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, coming from the trees, the lake, the very air. Come to the water. The last thing Sarah saw was the figure reaching for her, its hand cold and dripping, as the lake itself seemed to rise to meet her. And then there was silence. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The lake was calm, its surface undisturbed. The cabin sat empty, the door slightly ajar, and if you listened closely, you might hear a faint whisper carried on the wind. Come to the water. Days passed before anyone noticed Sarah's absence. Claire, concerned by her lack of messages, decided to drive up to Hollow Pines Lake to check on her. She told herself Sarah probably just needed time alone, but deep down, unease gnawed at her. The weather had cleared by the time Claire arrived. The lake bathed in a deceptive calm. The cabin stood as it had before, its rustic charm offset by an eerie stillness. The door was slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. Sarah, Claire called, stepping inside. The cabin was empty. Sarah's belongings were still there, her duffel bag half unpacked, her book lying open on the couch. But there was no sign of her friend. Claire's eyes fell on the windows. They were fogged over, though the air was warm and dry. Curious, she wiped a hand across one. and her breath hitched. The words "come to the water" were scrawled in what looked like condensation, or something thicker. "Sarah!" she called again, her voice trembling. The lake was visible through the window, its surface unnaturally still. Claire's stomach twisted as she noticed something peculiar. A figure standing at the shoreline, unmoving. She hurried outside, the grass damp beneath her feet as she approached the water. "Sarah, is that you?" The figure didn't respond. It was a woman, her back to Claire, her hair matted and wet, her clothes clinging to her body. Claire stepped closer, her concern outweighing her fear. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure turned slowly. It wasn't Sarah. The woman's face was pale and bloated, her eyes sunken and black as if they had been submerged for years. Water dripped from her lips as they parted, and a single word rasped from her throat. "Run." Claire froze, her blood turning to ice. The woman's gaze darted behind her, and Claire turned to see them, figures emerging from the lake. Dozens of them. Men, women, even children, their bodies waterlogged and twisted, dragging themselves onto the shore. Their movements were slow but purposeful, their lifeless eyes locked onto her. The whispers started then, low and guttural, rising from the water and the air around her. "Come to the water." Claire stumbled back, her heart hammering. She turned and ran toward the cabin, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The figures moved faster now, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they pursued her. She barely made it inside, slamming the door and locking it behind her. The whispers were deafening now, echoing through the cabin as if the walls themselves were alive. Claire grabbed her phone, but like Sarah, she had no signal. Panic surged through her as the whispers turned to pounding, fists striking the walls, the windows, the door, and then silence. Claire held her breath, her back pressed against the door. For a moment, she thought they were gone, until the voice came. "It's too late." She turned toward the window, and her scream was swallowed by the night. The lake was calling, and no one could resist its pull. Claire's scream seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence as her eyes locked on the window. Pressed against the glass was a face, not human, but something far worse. Its skin was translucent, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Black, hollow sockets stared into the cabin, and a grotesque grin revealed jagged, waterlogged teeth. Her legs gave way, and she stumbled back, gripping a nearby chair for support. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one hand and tapped a single, bony finger against the glass. Claire's breath caught. She took another step back. The sound echoed unnaturally, louder than it should have been, reverberating through the room. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing, wrapping around her like a chilling embrace. "Come to the water." Her heart raced as she bolted toward the back door, only to find it locked, though she didn't remember locking it. Her shaking hands fumbled with the latch, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself had turned against her. Behind her, the tapping grew into a pounding, the glass rattling in its frame. She turned her head, just enough to catch the window shatter in a spray of shards. A cold, wet hand reached inside, its fingers impossibly long, clawing at the air. Claire screamed and ran into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She braced it with her body, her chest heaving as she scanned the room. The single window offered no comfort. The lake was visible in the distance, its surface now roiling as if alive. A soft splash reached her ears, and she squinted. Something was rising from the water. Multiple somethings. They broke the surface slowly, like ancient statues emerging from their watery graves. The door behind her shuddered, a low groan filling the room as if the wood itself was in pain. She grabbed a lamp, clutching it like a weapon. "Leave me alone," she screamed, though she knew it was futile. The whispers answered, relentless and mocking. "Come to the water." The door burst open, throwing Claire backward onto the floor. She scrambled to her feet, swinging the lamp wildly, but the room was empty. No figures, no creatures, just the suffocating silence and the whispers that never stopped. Her eyes darted to the window, and her stomach dropped. Sarah stood there. She was waist deep in the lake, her body unnaturally still. Her hair hung in wet strands, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her lips parted, but the words that came weren't her own. "It's easier if you don't fight." Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Sarah. Fight it. Come back." But Sarah only raised one hand, beckoning her. Her head tilted further, and her voice grew louder, layered with countless others. "Come to the water." The cabin began to groan and creak, the walls warping as if the building itself were being pulled toward the lake. The floor beneath Claire's feet turned cold and wet, water seeping through the wood. Claire backed away, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go to the water. There had to be another way. Her eyes landed on the fireplace. The poker. She grabbed it, the cold metal steadying her shaking hands. If they wanted her, they'd have to fight for her. The whispers grew louder, the walls seeming to close in. Sarah's voice, distorted and hollow, was the last thing Claire heard before the window shattered. "You can't escape." The air in the cabin felt thick, oppressive, as if the weight of the lake itself had seeped into the very walls. Claire gripped the iron poker tighter, her knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape the cabin and the unrelenting whispers. But where could she go? Outside, the figures were gathering. Their silhouettes swayed like reeds in the wind, their bodies unnaturally fluid, as though the water still clung to them. And then there was Sarah, standing chest deep in the lake, her vacant gaze fixed on the cabin. "Come to the water," the whispers echoed, louder now, drilling into Claire's mind. "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. She backed away from the shattered window, her bare feet slipping on the damp wooden floor. The air smelled of rot, a sickly sweetness that made her stomach churn. Her back hit the far wall, and she slid down to the floor, clutching the poker like a lifeline. For a moment, the world went silent. The whispers stopped, the figures outside stilled, and even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic drip. Claire's eyes darted toward the ceiling. Water was leaking through the wooden planks, forming dark, expanding stains. The drips quickened, and before she could react, the ceiling above her buckled. A torrent of water poured into the cabin, crashing onto the floor with enough force to knock her sideways. She scrambled to her knees, coughing as icy water soaked her clothes. The cabin floor was submerged in moments, the water rising rapidly. And then she saw it. Emerging from the water was a figure, taller than the others, its form towering and grotesque. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers ending in sharp, bone-like claws. Its head was featureless save for two sunken pits where eyes should have been. It moved toward her with a slow, deliberate grace, its body gliding over the surface of the rising water. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "Join us!" Claire screamed and swung the poker with all her strength, the iron slicing through the figure like smoke. It recoiled, hissing, and the whispers faltered for a brief moment. Fueled by desperation, Claire stumbled to her feet and made for the door. The water was nearly knee-deep now, and the cabin's walls groaned as though they were about to collapse. She burst through the door and into the storm, the cold rain mingling with the icy water below. The figures were everywhere, their blank faces turned toward her. Their mouths moved in unison, chanting the same haunting words. "Come to the water." Claire ran, her legs burning as she pushed through the rising flood. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get as far from the lake as possible. But the landscape had changed. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath her feet was soft and unstable, pulling her down with every step. The rain was deafening, and the whispers followed her, carried on the wind. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard Sarah's voice, clear and desperate. "Claire, help me." She stopped, her heart pounding. "Sarah," she called, her voice cracking. "Where are you? Help me." The voice was closer now, coming from the direction of the lake. Claire turned, torn between the instinct to flee and the pull to save her friend. "Sarah, I'm coming," she yelled, against every rational thought. She stumbled back toward the shoreline, her feet sinking deeper into the mud. The lake was alive with movement, the water churning as if something massive lurked beneath the surface. Sarah was there, still standing in the lake, her hand outstretched. Her face was pale and wet, but her eyes were filled with fear. "Claire, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I can't hold on much longer." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. Was this real, or another trick? Behind her, the towering figure emerged from the trees, its movement slow but unrelenting. The whispers grew louder, pressing into her skull, urging her toward the lake. "You can save her," they said, "but you must come to the water." Claire's grip tightened on the poker. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling, "is it really you?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Please, Claire, don't leave me." Claire took a cautious step forward, the cold water lapping at her ankles. The lake seemed to respond, its surface rippling with anticipation. And then Sarah smiled. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the lips, but it grew, stretching impossibly wide. Her eyes darkened, and her voice, once trembling with fear, became low and guttural. "Come to the water, Claire." Claire screamed, stumbling backward as Sarah's body began to sink, pulled down by unseen hands. The figures in the water moved closer, their blank faces staring at her as if waiting for her to join them. The towering creature let out a guttural roar, the sound shaking the ground beneath her. Claire turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought against the mud and water. The forest closed in around her, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers followed her, relentless and mocking, their words etching themselves into her mind. "You can't escape." Finally, she saw it, a faint glow in the distance. The car. She pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest as she reached the vehicle. Fumbling with the keys, she threw the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and she floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning against the wet ground before catching traction. The figures in the rearview mirror grew smaller as she sped away, the lake disappearing into the storm. But the whispers didn't stop. Even as she reached the safety of the main road, even as the lake faded from view, they followed her, their voices echoing in her mind. Come to the water. Claire didn't stop driving until the sun began to rise, its pale light barely cutting through the overcast sky. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The road stretched endlessly ahead, bordered by dense, shadowy forests. She glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figures from the lake pursuing her. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind her. The whispers, though faint now, still echoed in her mind. Come to the water. Her breath shuddered as she pulled into a gas station at the edge of a small town. The building looked worn, its neon sign flickering faintly in the gray dawn. She parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to gather herself. Her clothes were still damp, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion. When she finally stepped out, the attendant behind the counter watched her with cautious curiosity. "Long night?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Claire hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "You could say that. You look like you've been through hell." He gestured to the coffee machine in the corner. "Help yourself. On the house." Grateful, she poured herself a cup and took a seat by the window. The warmth of the coffee steadied her hands, but her mind raced with questions. What had happened at the lake? What were those things? And what had become of Sarah? She took out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated over Sarah's name, her thumb hovering above the call button. Finally, she pressed it, knowing there would be no answer. The line rang once, twice, then it connected. Claire. Her breath caught. The voice on the other end was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Sarah," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Where are you? What happened?" "Claire," the voice said again, trembling with desperation. "You have to come back. Please. I'm still here." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "No, I saw you. I'm not dead." Sarah's voice cracked, filled with raw fear. "They're holding me. The lake, it's alive. The line went silent, replaced by a low, distorted hum. Then came the whisper, soft but clear. "Come to the water." Claire dropped the phone, her pulse racing. Her coffee spilled across the table as she stood, her chair screeching against the tile floor. "You okay, miss?" the attendant asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded quickly, grabbing her things. I have to go." The man didn't press her, watching as she hurried out to her car and slammed the door. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, confusion, guilt. If Sarah was still alive, if there was even the slightest chance, she couldn't leave her behind. But going back meant facing whatever horrors awaited her at the lake. The drive back felt surreal, as if the world had shifted somehow. The forests were darker, the sky heavier with clouds. By the time she reached the familiar winding road leading to Hollow Pines Lake, it was late afternoon. The air was eerily still, the trees unmoving despite the growing storm clouds. She parked at the edge of the lake, her car hidden among the trees. The cabin stood in the distance, its windows dark. The shoreline was empty, the water unervingly calm. "Sarah," she called, her voice breaking the silence. There was no response. She stepped closer to the water, her boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted and rippling as if the lake were alive. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, breaking the surface just a few feet away. "Sarah," she whispered, stepping closer. The hand disappeared, replaced by a face. It wasn't Sarah. The bloated, eyeless visage stared up at her, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. Claire stumbled back, her heart hammering as more figures began to emerge. Dozens of them, their bodies broken and waterlogged, their lifeless eyes fixed on her. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Come to the water." And then she saw Sarah. Her friend stood among the figures, her body trembling but her eyes pleading. "Claire, help me," she screamed, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Claire's mind raced. She didn't know how to fight this, but she couldn't leave Sarah. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the water, the icy cold searing her skin. The figures surged toward her, their hands reaching, their whispers growing louder. But Claire didn't stop. She kept her eyes on Sarah, her determination overriding her fear. The water rose to her knees, her waist, her chest. The figures surrounded her, their hands brushing against her skin, their faces inches from hers. "Sarah!" she screamed, reaching out. Sarah's hand met hers, and for a moment, Claire felt hope. But then she saw it, the faint smile on Sarah's lips, the darkness in her eyes. "I told you," Sarah said, her voice low and guttural. "It's easier if you don't fight." The lake erupted, pulling Claire under as the whispers consumed her. And then there was silence. The lake returned to its unnatural calm, the surface smooth and undisturbed. Far away, in the stillness of the cabin, the phone began to ring. And if anyone had been there to answer, they might have heard the faintest whisper, "Come to the water." The lake remained still, its surface betraying no sign of the horrors it concealed. Hollow Pines had been quiet for years after the disappearances of Sarah and Claire, the stories of the cursed waters reduced to hushed whispers in the nearby towns. But for some, silence was never enough to erase the pull of unanswered questions. David knew about the lake. Everyone in his family did. His grandmother had spoken of it in cryptic warnings. The lake remembers. It doesn't forgive. He dismissed her as superstitious, a relic of an older generation. But when he came across an old police report detailing the unsolved disappearances of two women, Sarah Keller and Claire Rowe, something unsettled him. Their car had been found abandoned near the lake, and a cabin rental ledger showed Sarah's name, with Claire's added hastily in pen. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, but whispers around town painted a chilling picture. The lake had taken them. David, an investigative journalist by trade, couldn't resist the draw of the mystery. He told himself it was professional curiosity, but the truth ran deeper. His grandmother's words haunted him, and he wanted to understand why Hollow Pines Lake had become a place of fear. So one autumn evening, under the guise of work, David packed his camera, a flashlight, and a tape recorder, and drove toward the lake. The cabin was still there. The years hadn't been kind to it. Moss crept up its walls, and its windows were clouded with grime. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. David parked his truck a safe distance away and approached cautiously. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. As he stepped inside, The floor creaked beneath his boots. Dust floated in the weak beam of his flashlight, and the whispers of the past seemed to echo in the silence. David set up his recorder on the table and began speaking. "I'm standing inside the cabin where Sarah Keller and Claire Rowe were last seen. No signs of disturbance, but—" He paused, squinting at the far wall. Water stains had spread across the wood, forming jagged, web-like patterns. They seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, as though they were fresh. A chill ran down his spine. He took a step closer, reaching out to touch the wall. The wood was ice cold, and as his fingers brushed the surface, the whispers began. Faint at first, like a distant wind, but growing louder with each passing second. "Come to the water." David staggered back, his heart pounding. He swung his flashlight toward the door, but nothing was there. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, grabbing the recorder and bolting outside. The lake stretched out before him, eerily calm under the pale moonlight. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. He hesitated, debating whether to leave, but the journalist in him refused to back down. Instead, he set the recorder on a log near the water's edge and pressed record again. "Something strange is happening here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I can't explain it, but—" A splash cut him off. David froze. His eyes locked on the lake. The water rippled unnaturally, as though something massive was moving just beneath the surface. And then a figure emerged. It was a woman, her hair dripping, her clothes clinging to her body. She looked ordinary at first glance, but as she stepped closer, David saw her face. It was wrong. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, her lips twisted into a haunting smile. "Help me," she said, her voice a rasping whisper. "Please don't leave me here." David's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Claire," she replied, her head tilting slightly. "I'm still here. You can save me." He stumbled back, his mind racing. The reports had said both women were missing, presumed dead. But here she was, or something that resembled her. "What happened to you?" he asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. She took another step forward, the water barely moving around her. "They won't let me go, but you can help. You just have to come to the water." David shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "No, I'm not going in there." Claire's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Her voice deepened, layered with countless others. "Come to the water." The lake erupted behind her, dozens of figures rising from its depths. They were grotesque, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes dark voids. They moved toward David with an unnatural grace, their mouths forming soundless screams. He turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the forest swallowed him. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape." David didn't stop until he reached his truck. He threw himself inside, slamming the door and locking it. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. As he sped away, the road seemed endless, the trees closing in around him. But the lake wasn't done with him. The whispers seeped into his mind, threading through his thoughts like poison. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw Sarah's face in the rearview mirror, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help us," she mouthed. The truck skidded to a halt as David slammed on the brakes. His heart raced, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. When he looked again, the mirror was empty, but the whispers remained, soft and relentless. Come to the water. David knew he should leave, forget the lake and its horrors. But as he drove into the night, a chilling realization settled over him. The lake had marked him, and no matter how far he ran, it would always call him back. David barely slept that night. The motel room was suffocating, its peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent light only amplifying the unease settling in his chest. The whispers had quieted for now, but he could still feel the lake's presence, a heavy weight pressing down on his mind. He had replayed the recording a dozen times. On it, his own voice trembled, recounting the strange events, but the whispers, clear and haunting, were unmistakable. Come to the water. There was also something else, a faint, rhythmic sound in the background. It wasn't until the sixth playback that David realized it was the sound of footsteps, wet, deliberate, and drawing closer. Yet, no one had been there. Morning arrived with little comfort. The gray sky outside seemed to mirror his exhaustion. David sat at the small desk in his room, staring at a map of hollow pines and its surrounding areas. The lake wasn't marked, which didn't surprise him. According to old news reports, it had long been considered cursed ground. Some locals avoided even speaking its name, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen or heard. Sarah, he murmured to himself. The name felt heavy on his tongue. If there was even a fragment of truth to what the figure at the lake had said, Sarah might still be there, trapped in whatever nightmare the lake harbored. David's phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was an email from his editor. You've been off the grid for 24 hours. Where's the story? He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could he say? That he'd found a lake haunted by whispers and drowning souls? That he'd seen Claire, alive, yet grotesquely wrong, pleading for help? No one would believe him. Instead, he typed a quick response, following a lead. We'll send updates soon. His mind was made up. He had to return to the lake, not just for the story, but for answers. The drive back to Hollow Pines felt shorter this time, as though the lake was drawing him in. The road grew narrower, the trees denser, their branches arching overhead like a canopy. When he reached the shoreline, the air was heavier than before. The wind carried a metallic tang, and the water, though still, seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. David stepped out of the truck, his gear slung over his shoulder. He'd brought more this time, a drone for aerial footage, a digital recorder, and a small handheld camcorder. Okay, he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. Let's see what you're hiding. He launched the drone first, its whirring blades cutting through the silence. The live feed displayed the lake's surface, unremarkable except for its unnatural stillness. But then, as the drone moved toward the center of the lake, something strange appeared on the screen. Beneath the water, faint but unmistakable, were shadows. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like a school of fish. But these weren't fish. The shapes were humanoid, their limbs stretching and twisting as if struggling against an unseen force. David's pulse quickened. He adjusted the drone's altitude, lowering it closer to the surface. As the camera focused, one of the shapes stopped moving. It turned upward, and for a split second, David thought he saw a face staring back at him, its empty eyes locked onto the lens. The drone feed cut to static. Damn it, David cursed, frantically pressing buttons. But the drone wouldn't respond. The lake, however, did. The water began to ripple, gentle at first, but quickly escalating into violent waves. The once silent air was filled with the low, guttural hum he'd heard on the recording. And then came the whispers. "Come to the water." David staggered back, his mind racing. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his chest. He dropped the controller and grabbed his camcorder, pointing it toward the lake. "Show me," he said aloud, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The water stilled abruptly, its surface glass-like once more. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, rising slowly from the center of the lake, was a figure. It was Claire again, but she wasn't alone. A second figure emerged beside her. Sarah. David's breath caught. Sarah looked different from the nightmarish figures he'd seen before. Her face, though pale, was undeniably human, her expression one of pleading. "David," she called, her voice carrying unnaturally across the water. "Please, help me. Don't leave me here." He froze, torn between fear and the instinct to help. "Sarah, what's happening? How do I help you?" "You have to come closer," she said, extending a trembling hand. "It won't let us leave, but you can break the cycle." "The cycle?" he asked, his voice shaking. Claire turned to him, her smile razor-sharp. "All you have to do is come to the water." David took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run. But Sarah's gaze held him in place. "Please, David," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't let it take me too." His heart pounded as he stared at the lake. Every instinct told him this was a trap, yet he couldn't ignore the possibility that Sarah might be telling the truth. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, wet and unstable, as though the earth itself was urging him forward. David's grip tightened on the camcorder. "If I go in there," he said, his voice steadying, "how do I know you won't pull me under too?" Sarah hesitated, her expression filled with anguish. "You don't," she admitted. "But if you leave, it'll follow you. It always does." The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The figures in the lake multiplied, their blank faces emerging just beneath the surface. David's breath hitched. The lake wasn't going to let him leave, not without something in return. He took a step closer to the water, the cold seeping through his boots. "If I do this," he said, his voice trembling, "you better tell me how to stop it." Sarah nodded, her eyes desperate. "Just take my hand." David hesitated, the whispers clawing at his sanity. But as he reached out, the water exploded around him, and the shadows surged forward. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Sarah's face, her lips forming two words. "I'm sorry." David's body plunged into the freezing water, the icy tendrils wrapping around him like living chains. His vision blurred as darkness enveloped him, the surface vanishing above as he was pulled deeper. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside his head, coiling around his thoughts and drowning his will. "You were chosen," he thrashed, trying to resist, but his movements felt sluggish, like his body no longer obeyed him. Around him, shapes moved, those shadowy figures he'd seen from the drone. Up close, they were even more grotesque. Twisted bodies, faces frozen in silent screams, their skin bloated and gray. In the chaos, Sarah appeared. She swam toward him with an eerie grace, her hair floating around her pale face like a halo. Her expression was no longer pleading but serene, almost otherworldly. "David," she said, her voice perfectly clear despite the water. "Stop fighting. It's easier this way." "No," he tried to shout, but his words were swallowed by the lake. He kicked harder, desperate to break free, but Sarah's hand reached out and grabbed his arm. "You don't understand," she whispered, her grip tightening. "It's not just a lake. It's alive. And it's hungry." Her words chilled him more than the freezing water. He tried to pull away, but Sarah's strength was inhuman. Her nails dug into his skin, and her face began to change, her features twisting into something monstrous. "You have to stay," she said, her voice deepening. "It demands a price." Before David could react, the shadows surged around him, their icy fingers pulling him deeper into the abyss. He awoke gasping, his lungs burning as though they had been emptied and refilled. He wasn't in the lake anymore. He was lying on the floor of the cabin, soaked to the bone. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the filthy windows. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined everything, but then he noticed the water. It seeped in from the cracks in the walls and pooled around him, cold and stagnant. The whispering hadn't stopped either. It was softer now, a constant hum at the edge of his consciousness. David sat up, his body trembling. His camera and recorder were gone, as was the drone. Panic rose in his chest as he realized he was completely alone. His truck keys, his phone, even his flashlight, all missing. The cabin door creaked open slowly. David's breath caught. Standing in the doorway was Claire. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. She stepped inside, her movements fluid, almost serpentine. "I'm not doing anything, David. The lake makes its own choices. You were drawn here for a reason. What does it want?" Claire tilted her head, her sharp smile returning. "It wants what it's always wanted, to feed, but not on your body, on your soul, your mind." David stumbled to his feet, his fists clenched. "I'm not giving it anything." Claire's laughter echoed through the cabin, sharp and hollow. "You don't have a choice, David. You're already part of it. The moment you stepped into the water, you belonged to the lake." The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a cyclone. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it was useless. "Come to the water." Claire stepped closer, her face inches from his. Her breath smelled like decay. "You'll see soon enough. The lake never lets you leave." With a sudden burst of strength, David shoved her aside and bolted out of the cabin. He didn't care about his truck or his gear. He just needed to get away. The forest felt different now, the trees looming closer, their branches clawing at him as he ran. The ground squelched beneath his feet, as though the entire forest was saturated with the lake's essence. He stumbled onto the dirt road, his lungs burning, his vision swimming with tears and fear. But when he looked up, his blood ran cold. The lake was in front of him. Impossible. He had run in the opposite direction. The shoreline stretched endlessly in both directions, the water still and dark. And standing at its edge was Sarah. "David," she said, her voice soft. "Stop running. It's worse if you run." "Stay away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking. Sarah's expression softened, her eyes glistening with tears. "I didn't want this. I didn't choose this. Please, David, if you come willingly, it won't hurt as much. He shook his head, backing away. No, I don't believe you. You're just like Claire. Sarah's face twisted with pain. I'm not, she cried. I'm still me. But if you don't stop fighting, you'll become like them. The water began to ripple, the shadows beneath the surface moving toward him. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out all rational thought. Come to the water. David fell to his knees, his strength failing him. The pull of the lake was overwhelming, its whispers sinking deep into his mind. Images flashed before him, visions of himself walking into the water, joining the countless souls trapped beneath its surface. And then, a new voice cut through the chaos. David, wake up. It wasn't Sarah or Claire. It was his grandmother. Her voice was sharp, commanding, filled with a power that seemed to push back the lake's influence. Remember what I told you, her voice echoed. The lake remembers. It doesn't forgive, but it can be tricked. David's mind latched onto her words like a lifeline. He forced himself to stand, his body trembling with exhaustion. How? He whispered, his voice barely audible. How do I stop it? The lake roared in response, its surface churning violently. Sarah screamed, her voice merging with the whispers. You can. But David wasn't ready to give up. If the lake could be tricked, he would find a way. He turned and ran, the forest swallowing him once more. The whispers pursued him, relentless. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. The lake wanted him to believe there was no escape. But he was determined to prove it wrong. David stumbled through the forest, the whispers biting at the edges of his sanity. The lake's pull was relentless, a constant weight pressing on his mind. Every step felt heavier, as though invisible hands were dragging him back. He clung to his grandmother's voice, the words echoing in his memory. The lake remembers. It doesn't forgive, but it can be tricked. What had she meant? How do you trick something so vast, so ancient, and so alive? The forest opened into a small clearing, and David collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping for breath. His body ached, his clothes were soaked and freezing, and his thoughts swirled with panic and exhaustion. But then, through the haze, he remembered something, a story his grandmother had told him when he was a child. It wasn't always a lake, she had said, her voice low and reverent. Long ago, it was a place of sacrifice, a hollow where people gave offerings to the earth, begging for its favor. But the offerings weren't enough, so they gave more and more, until the hollow became a graveyard. Her words had terrified him then, but now they felt like a key. If the lake wasn't always there, then maybe its power wasn't absolute. David reached into his pocket and found his notebook, miraculously still there despite everything. He flipped through its waterlogged pages, searching for the sketches he'd made of the surrounding area. The lake hadn't always been this size. Satellite images showed that it had expanded over the decades, swallowing parts of the forest and nearby landmarks. But there was one place it hadn't reached, an old stone circle at the edge of the Hollow Pines woods. The circle had been a mystery to archaeologists, too small to be a true monument, yet older than anyone could explain. His grandmother had called it the Watchers. David didn't know why, but he felt certain that the stone circle held the answer. If the lake had grown over time, maybe the Watchers were a boundary, a remnant of something that could contain it. The journey to the stone circle was agonizing. The whispers grew louder with every step, and the forest seemed to shift around him, twisting into a labyrinth designed to lead him back to the water. At one point, he thought he saw Sarah again, her pale face peering out from behind a tree. "You're wasting time," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't stop it, David. You're only making it angrier." "I don't believe you," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "You're part of it." Her expression flickered, momentarily human. "I was, but I didn't want to be. None of us did." Her form dissolved into shadows, and the whispers surged again, louder and more chaotic. David pressed on. The stone circle appeared just as dawn began to break, its ancient pillars weathered and covered in moss. The clearing around it was eerily silent, as though the lake's influence couldn't quite reach this far. David approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The air here felt different, lighter, but charged with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. In the center of the circle was a large, flat stone, its surface etched with strange symbols. David ran his fingers over the carvings, their meaning just out of reach. "Come to the water," the whispers taunted, fainter now but still persistent. "No," David muttered. "I'm done playing your game." He pulled out his notebook, sketching the symbols and comparing them to the notes he'd gathered about local folklore. His grandmother had mentioned something about a warding ritual, a way to seal off the hollow and trap whatever lived there. The pieces were starting to fit together. David's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, his flashlight illuminating a figure emerging from the trees. It was Claire. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low. David raised the flashlight higher. "Why?" "Afraid I'll figure out how to stop this." Claire stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "You can't stop it. The lake is older than you can imagine. It's not just water, it's a prison, and what's inside doesn't want to stay locked away." Her words sent a chill down David's spine. "A prison for what?" Claire's smile was haunting. "You'll find out soon enough." She lunged at him, her hands clawing at his throat. David stumbled back, falling against one of the stone pillars. The contact sent a jolt through his body, and suddenly the whispers stopped. Claire froze, her eyes widening in shock. "You shouldn't have touched that," she hissed. Realization dawned on David. The stones weren't just markers, they were active. He scrambled to his feet, pressing his hand against the pillar again. The forest seemed to shudder, and for a moment, the whispers were replaced by a deep, resonant hum. Claire screamed, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You don't know what you're doing." David ignored her, moving to the next pillar and pressing his hand against it. The hum grew louder, and the air around the circle became charged with energy. The lake's pull was stronger now, a tangible force trying to drag him back. But David pressed on, activating each pillar in turn. When he reached the final stone, the ground trembled violently. The hum became a deafening roar, and a blinding light erupted from the center of the circle. Claire's screams were lost in the chaos as her body dissolved into shadow. The light spread outward, racing toward the lake like a tidal wave. David collapsed, his vision swimming. The last thing he saw was the lake's surface churning violently, its shadows twisting and writhing as the light consumed them. And then, silence. When David awoke, the sun was high in the sky, and the air was still. The stone circle was intact, but the energy it had radiated was gone. He staggered to his feet and made his way back to the lake. What he saw took his breath away. The lake was gone. In its place was a barren hollow, its muddy surface cracked and dry. The shadows were gone, and the whispers had finally ceased. David felt a wave of relief wash over him. He didn't know if the lake was truly gone forever, but for now, the nightmare was over. As he turned to leave, a faint echo reached his ears, carried on the wind. The lake remembers. David stood at the edge of the hollow. The emptiness where the lake had been now a barren expanse of cracked earth. The light that had once glowed beneath its surface was gone, replaced by the still, lifeless remnants of what had been. For a long moment, he simply stared at the ground, his chest heavy with exhaustion and a strange emptiness that mirrored the land before him. He had done it. He had stopped the cycle. But as the wind howled through the empty trees, a small, persistent thought gnawed at him. Had he truly stopped it? Or had he merely delayed the inevitable? The voice from the past echoed in his mind, his grandmother's warning. The lake remembers. It doesn't forgive, but it can be tricked. David turned away from the hollow and began walking back to the forest. His legs felt like lead, his mind clouded with doubt. But something had changed. He could feel it in the air, something just beyond his reach, a dark presence lingering in the quiet of the woods. The whispers had stopped, but there was a new, more insidious feeling, an awareness. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him. As he moved through the forest, the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. It was peaceful, too peaceful, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. He had survived the lake, but had the lake truly been defeated? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had merely peeled away one layer of a much darker story. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. David stopped, his heart skipping a beat. He turned, but no one was there. His breath quickened. The forest seemed to close in around him, the air thick and oppressive. The trees now felt like silent witnesses to some forgotten ritual. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, a subtle shift, but enough to make him pause. Come back. The whisper was faint, like the breeze rustling through the leaves, but it was unmistakable. David's blood ran cold. He had heard it too clearly, too directly. The lake. It wasn't finished with him. The earth trembled again, this time more violently. A crack appeared in the ground ahead of him, splitting the earth like a yawning mouth. From deep within, something stirred, slow and deliberate, like an ancient being waking from its slumber. David backed away, his pulse hammering in his chest. The trees swayed as though in response to the unseen force rising from the depths. He knew now that the lake's pull had never truly gone away. It was merely hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. His grandmother's warnings rang in his ears. The lake doesn't forget. It waits. The ground before him cracked wide open, revealing a deep, black void that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. From it, figures began to emerge. Hazy, indistinct shapes, but the air around them shimmered with malevolence. Their forms twisted in ways that defied logic, moving like shadows stretching across the fabric of reality. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding him. You cannot escape. David stumbled back, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. He had tried. He had thought he had escaped, but the lake was more than just water. It was a part of something older, something that had always been there. The pull of the abyss wasn't limited to the water. It had a reach beyond the boundaries of the lake itself, and it was pulling him back. The ground began to quake beneath his feet, and the figures grew clearer. They were not human, at least not anymore. Faces stretched in unnatural angles, their eyes hollow and black as if the very essence of life had been drained from them. Their mouths opened wide, but no sound emerged, only the silent scream of a lost soul. David turned and ran, his feet pounding against the earth as the forest seemed to warp around him. The trees loomed in on him, their branches reaching for him like claws. The shadows underfoot grew longer, twisting in impossible directions. "Please," he gasped. "I just want to leave. Let me leave." But the whispers surrounded him. "You never left." The ground beneath his feet cracked wide open, and David fell down into the darkness. David awoke in darkness. His eyes shot open, but all he could see was an endless void. His body felt weightless, as if he were suspended in nothingness. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive, as if they had been shackled by the very air itself. The whispers were louder now, not in his ears, but in his mind. "You've always been here." David's heart raced. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void. There was no sound, no sensation except the oppressive weight of the darkness. He could feel something watching him, something ancient and unfathomable. The shadows around him shifted, and he could make out shapes. A figure, standing at the edge of the void. The figure was tall, its form obscured in shadow, but its eyes gleamed like burning coals. The air around it seemed to warp and distort. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice breaking. The figure's lips didn't move, but David heard its voice in his mind. "I am the lake." David's pulse thundered in his chest. "No, I destroyed the lake. I stopped it." The figure tilted its head, its smile stretching wider. "You destroyed the water, David, but the lake is not just water. It is a place, a prison, and you are its prisoner." David struggled against the weight, but it was useless. His mind felt like it was unraveling. "What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its voice deep and hollow. "I don't want anything from you, David. I want everything from you." The shadows around him shifted, and he could make out shapes. A figure, standing at the edge of the void. The figure was tall, its form obscured in shadow, but its eyes gleamed like burning coals. The air around it seemed to warp and distort. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice breaking. The figure's lips didn't move, but David heard its voice in his mind. "I am the lake." David's pulse thundered in his chest. "No, I destroyed the lake. I stopped it." The figure tilted its head, its smile stretching wider. "You destroyed the water, David, but the lake is not just water. It is a place, a prison, and you are its prisoner." David struggled against the weight, but it was useless. His mind felt like it was unraveling. "What do you want from me?" The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its voice deep and hollow. "I don't want anything from you, David. I want everything from you." David's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood amidst the figures, trapped in the darkness. He could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, their presence more suffocating than the darkness itself. Every inch of his body screamed to run, to fight, but the pressure around him was too great. His mind felt fractured, the whispers swirling around him, louder than ever before. You are ours now. The figure in the center, the one who had claimed to be the lake, stepped closer. Its form remained indistinct, but its eyes, those burning coals, seemed to pierce through him, unraveling the fabric of his thoughts. He could feel his consciousness slipping, the remnants of his identity slipping away like sand through his fingers. You were always meant to return, the figure said, its voice vibrating through the very core of his being. The lake has claimed all who dared to approach, and now you are no different. You will join us in the depths. David's legs buckled beneath him as the ground beneath him seemed to pull away, sucking him deeper into the void. The figures around him closed in, their skeletal hands reaching toward him, their eyes hollow with an ancient hunger. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The very air seemed to be suffocating him. His body felt heavy, paralyzed, his mind frantically searching for a way out, but all he could hear were the whispers, swirling, pressing in on him from all sides. There is no escape. The world around David shifted, fading and blurring like a dream slipping away. Suddenly, he found himself standing in a place that was neither familiar nor foreign. An endless expanse of water stretched before him, a lake as vast as the horizon itself. The water was still, its surface like glass, reflecting an eerie, pale sky. But something was wrong. The reflections weren't his own. Instead, he saw countless faces staring back at him, their expressions frozen in terror and sorrow. The faces were familiar. Some were people he had known, others were strangers, but all shared one thing in common. They were drowned. Their eyes were wide with horror, their mouths open in silent screams. David stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The realization hit him like a cold wave. These were the souls of the lake, trapped in its depths for eternity. Welcome to your final destination. A voice echoed around him, low and hollow. The figure appeared again, standing at the far edge of the water, watching him with its burning eyes. It didn't need to move to command David's attention. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze him. This is where you will stay, David. You will join them. You will become one with the lake. No, David whispered, his voice trembling. I won't let you have me. I won't join them. But as the words left his mouth, the water in front of him began to churn. The faces in the water twisted, their mouths opening wider, and the whispering grew louder, more desperate. Join us! Join us! Join us! David backed away, but the water surged forward, engulfing his legs. The cold was unbearable, the water like ice seeping into his very bones. He could feel the weight of it dragging him down, pulling him toward the depths. The figure's eyes gleamed, watching his every movement, its smile widening. There is no escaping. The lake always claims what it desires. David's body tensed. The cold seeping into him wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. He could feel something deep within him beginning to fray, something that had once made him human, now starting to slip away. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but it was becoming more distant, less real. In the distance, the faces of the drowned twisted in unison, their eyes fixated on him, their voices rising in a chorus of terror. Join us! Join us! Join us! David screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the water. He struggled, but the pull of the lake was too powerful, too consuming. The world around him distorted, swirling with shadows and faces, until he could no longer tell where the water ended and the air began. And then, Just as his strength began to wane, something flickered within him, an ember of resistance, a spark of defiance. His grandmother's voice. The lake can be tricked. David's eyes snapped open. The whispers, the faces, the pressure, they all faded for a moment. The realization hit him with the force of a lightning bolt. The lake didn't just take, it also gave. What if he could reverse it? What if he could trick the lake into thinking he was already one of them? David closed his eyes, drawing on the memories of his grandmother's teaching. She had always said that the lake was a reflection, a twisted mirror of the human soul. To fool it, to escape, one had to look into that mirror and become something it could never claim. A plan formed in his mind, desperate, fragile, but it was all he had. David opened his eyes again, his heart pounding in his chest. The water around him had frozen, not solid, but still, unnaturally still. The faces were no longer moving. The whispers had faded into silence. With all the strength he had left, David reached deep within himself, pulling from the darkness that had begun to consume him. He focused on the reflection of himself in the water, but it wasn't his reflection. It was a twisted version of himself, distorted by the lake's power. His face was gaunt, his eyes blackened, and his mouth stretched into a silent scream. But David didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He allowed himself to see the darkness, the hunger, and then he embraced it. For a moment, everything stilled. The lake's influence receded, retreating as though it had never been there. The distorted version of himself in the water stared back, its eyes vacant, its smile hollow. And then, the world around him shifted again. David awoke with a gasp, his body jerking upright as if pulled from a deep sleep. He was no longer in the lake, nor was he surrounded by the figures. The forest was quiet, still, and the sun was high in the sky. It was over, for now. But deep within his soul, David could feel it, a whisper, a promise. The lake had been tricked, but it was never truly gone. The hunger had not been satisfied, and one day it would return. He had survived, but the lake had claimed something from him, something that could never be taken back. The darkness, the hollow smile in the water, it was a part of him now. David didn't look back as he walked away, but he could feel the weight of the lake behind him. He knew one thing for certain: the lake didn't forgive, and it never forgets. David moved through the forest, the stillness pressing in on him, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. His mind, ever clouded with doubt and fear, refused to let go of the image that haunted him, the twisted reflection in the water, the hollow, cold eyes that had stared back at him, the soul he had almost lost, clinging to him like a second skin. The lake hadn't taken him, no, not entirely, but it had marked him. He could feel it now, more than ever. It was an insidious presence, one that lurked in the quietest moments of his thoughts, waiting for weakness. The hunger, the pull of the water, far beneath the earth, calling out to him like a siren song. It wasn't gone, it had only been delayed. The lake had not forgiven him, and David could feel its insatiable thirst stirring again, far off but growing louder. The sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy above him, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It had been days since the event at the lake, but the memories had never faded. In fact, they had only become more vivid, more real with every passing hour. The figures that had emerged from the depths, The unsettling sensation of being watched, the whispers, they were all still with him. The wind picked up, sending a shiver through the trees. Something was different. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and the sound of distant water seemed to echo, barely audible. His heartbeat quickened. He had to get out. He had to get away from the forest. But no matter how far he walked, the feeling of the lake seemed to follow him, tugging at him with every step. As David pushed through the underbrush, the path began to open into a clearing. But it wasn't the peaceful clearing he had hoped for. It was the same clearing he had passed through earlier, the one that led to the lake. It couldn't be. He must have turned the wrong way. But as he looked around, he saw it. The ground beneath him was no longer just dirt. It was damp, as though soaked with water. A thin mist clung to the earth, swirling in the breeze, and in the distance, he saw the silhouette of the lake. The waters had returned. He had thought he had escaped. His breath hitched in his chest as the familiar, dreadful realization washed over him. The lake had found him again, and this time there would be no escaping. The air seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and as David approached the edge of the water, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were right beside him, as if the lake itself was speaking directly to him. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are mine. David's eyes widened in terror as he watched the surface of the water ripple, although there was no wind to stir it. It seemed to come alive before him, the reflections of the trees twisting and distorting into grotesque, contorted faces. They were the faces he had seen before, the drowned souls, the ones whose eyes were wide with horror and despair. They reached up, their arms slithering from the water, their faces desperate, pleading. Join us. The voices grew louder, a chorus of anguish. Join us. Join us. Join us. David staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only run. But the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the earth opening up in cracks that spread like veins, leading straight to the lake. It was like a living thing, a force that could manipulate everything around it. From the edge of the water, a figure began to rise. It was tall, silhouetted against the misty backdrop, but it wasn't the same as before. It was a shadow, a mass of darkness with glowing eyes that pierced the air like a laser. And as it stepped closer, David could hear its voice, not in his mind, but in the air around him, vibrating with an ancient power. You cannot escape what you are. The figure moved like liquid, flowing through the air with an unnatural grace. It was everywhere at once, surrounding him, suffocating him. Its presence grew stronger, and David felt his legs tremble beneath him. His body was no longer his own. It was as though the very ground was pulling at him, urging him to step into the water. Join us, David. His grandmother's warnings flashed in his mind again, but this time they seemed distant, irrelevant. How could he have known the lake's true nature? How could he have known it would never release him? He turned to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot. His hands shook as he tried to scream, but the air itself seemed to choke him. The shadows closed in around him, and the figure's eyes glowed brighter. This is where it ends, David. This is where it began. And now it will end again. But this time, you will never leave. The ground beneath David's feet cracked wide open, and the water surged forward, wrapping around him, dragging him into the depths. David's world became a swirling vortex of water, darkness, and agony. He fought against it, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to keep him afloat. The water swallowed him whole, pulling him down into the abyss, where the faces of the drowned twisted around him, their eyes locked onto his with unbearable intensity. "Join us." He couldn't breathe. The water filled his lungs, his throat tightening as he sank deeper and deeper. But through the suffocating darkness, he could still hear the whispers, the voices of the lake, and amidst them he heard something else, a laugh, low and mocking, as though the lake were amused by his futile resistance. And then the voices stopped. The water around him stilled. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but the suffocating silence. David's mind was slipping, but in the depths of his consciousness, he realized something. The lake hadn't claimed him. Not yet. It was waiting. It was waiting for him to give in, to accept it, to become one with it. But David would not surrender. Not yet. Not ever. David's body felt like it was being crushed, his limbs weighed down by an invisible force. His heart pounded against his chest, as if trying to escape the suffocating pressure of the water. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The darkness was consuming him, and the weight of the lake was relentless, dragging him deeper into the depths of the world he had tried to escape. But somewhere, deep within, there was a spark, a pulse of defiance, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. The lake had tried to claim him, to pull him into its eternal grip, but David wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He struggled, his body convulsing against the crushing pressure, reaching out with the last of his strength. His hands brushed against something solid, something alive, something familiar. It was a reflection. The reflection that haunted him, the reflection in the lake, had always been a twisted version of himself, but now, as he reached for it, something shifted. The shadowed face before him seemed to morph, becoming something else. Not a reflection, but a voice. "You can't escape. You never will." David's mind felt fractured, but he clung to the words like a lifeline. He didn't want to give in. He couldn't. Not to this force that had plagued him for so long. The voice, his voice, echoed around him, louder now. "You were always meant to return." "No," David screamed, though the sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the water. The reflection twisted again, this time into a face that wasn't his at all. It was his grandmother, the very woman who had warned him of the lake's power. The lake doesn't forget. It waits. He felt the world around him bend and contort, his body shifting through time and space. The water no longer felt cold. It was warm now, burning him, searing him. His skin stretched, his bones cracked as though being remade. The pressure was unbearable, the light of the world flickering out with each passing moment. But through it all, David held on. He fought against it with every ounce of will left in his shattered mind. He wasn't just fighting the lake. He was fighting everything it stood for, the endless cycle of terror, the ancient hunger that had claimed so many before him. His mind reached back, grasping for the knowledge his grandmother had passed to him all those years ago. There had to be a way. There had to be a way to break the cycle. Trick the lake, her voice echoed in his mind. It feeds on fear, on despair. But it can't feed on what it cannot see. David clung to that thought. He realized now that the lake didn't just feed on people. It fed on their souls. And it wasn't just the water that trapped them. It was the terror, the hopelessness, the belief that there was no escape. David didn't have to fight it. He didn't have to try and overpower it. What he needed was to show the lake what it wanted to see, and then, in that moment, escape it. He closed his eyes, focusing on the memory of the forest, the crisp air, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. He focused on his breath, slow and steady. In that brief, fleeting moment, he let go of everything, the fear, the grief, the panic. He let them all slip away, as though they were nothing more than an illusion. And for the first time since he'd set foot near the lake, he felt it, the weight lifting. The pressure that had been suffocating him began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of peace. David opened his eyes. The darkness was gone. The lake was no longer around him. He was standing in the middle of the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees as if nothing had ever happened. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. The whispering had stopped. The figure that had haunted him, the lake itself, was gone. David exhaled deeply, as though he had been holding his breath for years. He looked around, disoriented for a moment, but slowly everything began to make sense. He had done it. He had finally escaped. He was free. But as he stood there, alone in the forest, a familiar voice whispered once more, barely audible, like a memory from the past. The lake never forgets. David's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his pulse quickening, but there was nothing. Just the peaceful, quiet forest stretching out before him. He didn't understand. He had tricked the lake. It was over. It had to be. But then he looked down at his hands, and for the briefest of moments, they were not his. They were dark, contorted, almost as if the water had never truly let go of him. He blinked, and the image vanished. His hands were his own again, but the unease settled deeper within him. David knew in that moment, the lake had not given up. It had only retreated for now. It was a part of him now, as much a part of the land as the forest itself. The lake would wait, and when it returned, it would find him. And next time, he would not be so lucky. But David was no longer the man who had once feared it. He had faced it and survived. For now, days passed, and the world seemed to return to normal for David. The haunting presence of the lake, the whispers, the figure that had emerged from the water, it all seemed like a distant nightmare, fading as he went about his life. He found himself walking through the woods again, his feet crunching on the fallen leaves beneath him. The forest was quiet, peaceful even, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. But beneath the surface of his thoughts, there was something he couldn't quite shake. A gnawing feeling at the back of his mind that told him this was far from over. The lake hadn't disappeared. It had only bided its time. The forest, so full of life and growth, was only an illusion. The deeper darkness, the ancient pull of the lake, had merely slumbered, waiting for its chance to return. One night, David awoke with a start. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his chest tight as if something were pressing down on him. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering in through the window. He could hear the distant sound of water, the soft, rhythmic lapping of waves against the shore. For a moment, he thought he was back by the lake, but when he opened his eyes, he saw only the familiar surroundings of his bedroom. But the sound, it wasn't gone. The water was still there, calling to him, beckoning him. David sat up, his mind spinning, his body tense. He could feel the weight of the air in the room, thick and heavy, as if it was saturated with something ancient. The whispers were back, soft and insistent, just beyond the edge of his hearing. They swirled around him, voices distorted by distance and time, but their meaning was clear. "You cannot escape, David." He knew the lake was near, even though he could no longer see it. It had followed him again. It was inside his mind, his thoughts, his very soul. He tried to shake it off, tried to breathe deeply and calm himself, but the sensation was overwhelming. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. David stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He was not going to let this happen again. Not this time. The lake couldn't have him. He wouldn't allow it. But the moment he stepped out of his room, the air around him seemed to grow colder. The walls felt thinner, as if they could no longer protect him from what was waiting outside. The hallway stretched out before him, darker than usual, and as he walked toward the door, he could feel something watching him, waiting. The door creaked open as David stepped outside. The night air was cold, biting at his skin as he stepped into the yard. The moon hung high above, casting eerie shadows across the ground. His breath came out in puffs of mist, but the chill he felt wasn't from the air. It was the lake. He could feel it. Its presence was growing stronger. He walked toward the edge of the forest, the familiar path leading him toward the lake. His footsteps seemed heavier with each step, as if the ground itself was trying to pull him back into the earth. The wind whispered through the trees, and David felt a strange sense of vertigo as he moved deeper into the woods. There, just ahead, the lake came into view, its surface still and reflective under the pale moonlight. But something was different now. The water wasn't just reflecting the trees and the sky. It was alive. It rippled in unnatural patterns, swirling as if it were breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stood at the water's edge, staring into the depths. He could feel the pull again, that deep, ancient hunger, tugging at him from beneath the surface. But this time, there was something else. A sense of urgency. The lake wasn't just calling, it was ready. And then he saw it. A figure rising from the water, its silhouette emerging from the dark depths like something not quite human. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting, but there were two burning eyes, glowing red like coals, that pierced through the fog. "David," it whispered, its voice echoing in the night. "You thought you could escape, but you were always meant to return." David's legs froze in place. The figure stepped closer, its body made of shadows and liquid. He could feel the lake's power radiating from it, the coldness of its depths pressing against his skin. The lake had been waiting for him, biding its time, and now it was ready to claim him for good. "No," David whispered, his voice hoarse. He tried to take a step back, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The ground beneath him felt like quicksand, pulling him toward the water. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind, drowning out everything else. "Join us, David." But David wasn't afraid anymore. He understood now. The lake didn't just want him. It wanted to consume his very essence, to make him part of its eternal cycle. And it had tried to do that before, to make him believe that it had power over him. But this time, David wouldn't let it. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and reached deep within himself. He thought of his grandmother's teachings, of the power she had once spoken of, the ability to control the lake's hunger, to turn the tide. He would not give in. Not now. Not ever. He opened his eyes, and the reflection in the water shifted. It wasn't his face staring back at him. It was the face of the figure that had emerged from the depths, the twisted form of the lake itself. David raised his hand, feeling the warmth of his own energy gathering in the air around him. The lake shuddered, its surface rippling violently as though it were recoiling from him. The figure in the water faltered, its glowing eyes dimming as the power inside David grew stronger. "You have no power here," David said, his voice growing louder, more confident. "This is my mind, my soul, and I will not give you control." The water churned, bubbles rising to the surface, but David stood his ground. The lake was powerful, but it was not invincible. And in this moment, he realized something. The lake's true power wasn't in the water or the figures it claimed. It was in fear. It thrived on the terror it could cause, the despair it could plant in the hearts of those it touched. But if he could control his fear, if he could fight back against it. With a final, resolute shout, David focused every ounce of his strength, pushing against the lake's influence. The water before him roiled violently, and the figure let out an otherworldly scream as it was sucked back into the depths, vanishing beneath the surface. For a long moment, the forest was silent. The air cleared, the whispers faded, and the moonlight shone brightly once again. The lake was still. David stood at the water's edge, his heart racing, but his body finally at peace. The lake had been defeated, at least for now. He had learned its secret, faced its terror, and survived. But deep within him, David knew the truth. The lake would never truly go away. It would always be there, waiting, and one day it would return. David stood motionless at the edge of the lake, the eerie silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. He was not entirely sure what had happened, whether he had truly banished the lake's presence or merely pushed it back temporarily. What he did know was that, for now, the oppressive weight that had been hanging over him was gone. The water before him was still, unnaturally so, as if time itself had paused. For the first time in what felt like ages, David let himself breathe. His chest expanded, and the air seemed cleaner, fresher. The terror he had lived with for so long, that insidious, constant fear of the lake's pull, had lifted. At least, that's what he told himself. But the whispers still lingered, faint at the edges of his consciousness. They were quieter now, almost imperceptible, like a distant hum or the sound of wind rustling in the trees. Yet, they were unmistakable. "You have not escaped." David's heart skipped a beat, the calm he had fought so hard to achieve shattering in an instant. The words were not spoken aloud. They weren't coming from the lake. It was as if they were coming from inside his mind, twisting and pulling at the very core of his being. The voices were not the same as before, but the familiarity of their tone, the knowing weight of them, sent a chill down his spine. "You can never leave." David turned away from the water, his pulse quickening, his hands trembling. He had fought so hard to push the lake back, to take control of his own fate, but the lake was not simply a place. It was an entity, a force, and it was not bound by the laws of the physical world. It had followed him, found a way into his mind, his soul, long after he thought he had escaped. "It's in you now," the voice whispered again, closer this time, as if the very forest itself was breathing with it. "And it will never let you go." David's stomach churned as the weight of those words sank in. He had thought that by confronting the lake directly, by facing it, he had outsmarted it. He had tricked it into believing he would give in, only to turn the tide and make it retreat. But now he understood the truth. The lake had never been after his body. It had never been about drowning him in water or dragging him under. The lake wanted his soul, and now it had it. He tried to shake the thought away, but deep inside, he felt a darkness beginning to take root. A part of him that wasn't truly his own, a presence that was not fully his, like a shadow attached to him, constantly watching. The lake had seeped into him, entwining itself with his very being. In the distance, the sound of water gently lapping against the shore seemed to echo, louder now, as if the lake itself were calling him back, urging him to return. David's eyes darted nervously toward the water. The figure that had emerged from the depths earlier was still fresh in his mind, its glowing eyes and endless hunger. It had retreated, but for how long? The fear that he had buried deep within himself began to surface once again. He turned around, desperate to leave, to break free of the lake's reach, but something was stopping him. He felt as though the forest had closed in on him. The trees were no longer just trees. They were watching, listening. The shadows between them seemed darker now, more foreboding. He wasn't just in the woods anymore. He was in a place between worlds, a place where the lake's power touched everything. You cannot outrun it, the voice said, no longer a whisper but a command. You cannot escape the cycle. It is within you. It always will be. David's mind was racing. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a wave crashing against rocks. He was no longer the person he had been before the lake. The lake had changed him. It had marked him, and in some unfathomable way, it had become part of him. A piece of the darkness, of the hunger, had been etched into his soul, and no matter how far he ran, it would follow. The forest shifted, as if the trees themselves were moving, closing in on him. The mist from the lake began to creep into the woods, curling through the underbrush like fingers of the dead, reaching for him, pulling at his ankles. The moon overhead, once bright and comforting, now felt cold, distant. A sliver of light through the dense trees, casting an eerie glow on everything it touched. David felt himself sinking, his body no longer in control. The whispers around him grew louder. They were no longer just words. They were images, flashing before his eyes. Faces, voices, twisted reflections of those who had drowned in the lake, lost to it forever. He saw their hands reaching for him, begging him to join them, to give in. "Let go," they whispered, their voices desperate. "Let go, and we'll all be free." But David didn't want to let go. He couldn't. If he gave in, if he allowed the lake to claim him fully, then there would be no escape. He had fought for so long to regain control of his own fate, to survive this curse. And now, the weight of his choices was sinking in. The forest was alive now, alive with the presence of the lake, the very essence of it surrounding him. There was no longer a place of refuge, no more hiding. It had consumed the land, and David was caught in its grasp, a puppet to its will. The darkness thickened, swirling around him. The voices became a deafening chorus of screams, of sorrow, of despair. He could hear them all, pleading, begging for release, for rest. But he knew, he could feel it, the lake was never truly about death. It was about eternal suffering, the unending cycle of hunger and loss. The souls of those it claimed were never at peace. They would always be trapped in the water, in the whispers, in the darkness. David fell to his knees, overwhelmed, his breath ragged. There was no fighting it anymore. The lake had won. It had found him. And as the mist closed in around him, wrapping him in its suffocating grip, David knew one thing for certain. The cycle was unbroken. David's eyes snapped open, but there was no world around him. The air was thick with the scent of decay and brine, the unmistakable smell of water, of something ancient and alive. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment he thought he was drowning. But the feeling subsided as quickly as it came, and his surroundings began to take shape. He wasn't in the forest anymore. He wasn't even near the lake. No, this place was something else entirely. Somewhere between reality and nightmare, somewhere that shouldn't exist. It was dark, too dark. The only light came from a faint, sickly glow that seemed to pulse, as if the world itself was breathing. The ground beneath him was soft, but it wasn't solid earth. It was like wet clay, sticky, pulling at his feet as if trying to drag him under. The sensation made him want to scream, but no sound escaped. His mouth was dry, and the only thing he could hear was the slow, rhythmic sound of something moving beneath the surface. The realization hit him like a wave. The lake was still here. David staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady. His breath caught in his throat as his mind tried to piece together the fractured image of his surroundings. He had been standing at the edge of the lake. He had been fighting to hold on to his sanity, to resist the pull of the water. But now he was somewhere else. The water. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very space around him. The lake was no longer just a place. It was here, in this space between worlds, pressing in on him from every direction. He could feel it, its ancient, insidious presence all around him, suffocating him. Its hunger was endless, its grasp infinite. A voice echoed through the thick darkness, sharp and cold. "You thought you had escaped, David." He turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. The voice, he knew that voice. It was the same one that had whispered to him, the one that had promised him he would never escape. It was the lake. "I am not done with you." David's legs trembled, and for a moment, he felt the overwhelming urge to fall to the ground, to curl up and give in. But he couldn't. Not again. He had already faced the lake, already stood against its power. He couldn't lose himself to it again. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. You cannot fight what is within you. The voice wasn't just speaking to him. It was in his mind, his thoughts, pulling at his every fear, every doubt. It was making him question what was real, what was part of his own will, and what was simply the lake's will, shaping his thoughts, manipulating them. David stumbled forward, his body aching with exhaustion. He could feel the wetness of the floor beneath him now, a slick, cold surface that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The glow, faint as it was, became brighter as he moved, casting long shadows against the walls. And then, through the thick darkness, he saw something, no, someone. A figure stood ahead of him, obscured by shadows. It was humanoid, tall, and thin, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes glowed faintly, red and hollow, like two lanterns in the dark. David's throat tightened as he recognized it. The figure was like the ones he had seen in the lake, the ones that had dragged him down into its depths, the ones that had whispered to him in the dark. But this one was different. This one was him. The figure's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of David's own. its lips pulling back in a sneer that didn't belong. It wasn't a reflection. No, it was something worse. It was a part of him, a piece of his soul twisted by the lake's hunger. The voice that echoed through David's mind grew louder, more insistent, almost mocking. You cannot outrun yourself. David tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. His body refused to obey. The figure in front of him stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid, its presence suffocating. The lake has claimed you. You are its now. David's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the figure wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just an image. David could feel its cold fingers closing around his chest, tightening. He gasped for air, but it felt as though the world was closing in on him. The walls, the floor. It was all wet now, as if the very space he was in was beginning to flood, the water creeping up around his ankles. You have nowhere to run, the figure whispered, its voice now a low growl. You belong to the lake, and the lake will never let you go. David's mind screamed, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could feel was the overwhelming pressure of the lake, the ancient, unyielding force that had ensnared him, body and soul. It had found him again, not just in the physical world, but in his very mind, in the very core of his being. And as the water began to rise, swallowing him whole, David knew there would be no escaping this time. There was no fight left to be won, no more strength to summon. The lake had him now. It had always had him. As the water surged higher, taking him into its cold embrace, David's mind slipped into darkness. The last thing he heard was the voice, louder than ever. You are mine, forever. And then there was nothing. The lake had claimed him. The cycle was complete. The darkness consumed David completely, swallowing him whole in an endless sea of black. The oppressive silence that followed was suffocating, deeper than anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the complete absence of everything. No air, no light, no sensation. He wasn't drowning, not yet, but he could feel the lake's presence, its weight pressing down on him from every direction, a suffocating force that was as ancient as the world itself. David's mind raced, struggling to hold on to any sense of himself. It felt like he was falling into an abyss, deeper and deeper, into a place where time didn't exist. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a force of nature, an all-consuming entity that wrapped itself around his very soul. It had waited for so long. It had been patient. He could feel it now, the hunger. The lake had always been hungry, feeding on those who dared to get too close, those who ventured too far into its depths. But this was different. The hunger was not just for his body. It was for his soul, for his very essence. It was something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, and now it had him. You are mine, the voice echoed in his mind, distant yet intimate, cold yet unyielding. David tried to scream, to fight back, but his body felt distant, unresponsive. There was no escape. He was trapped in the darkness, caught in the embrace of the lake that had claimed him. For what felt like an eternity, he floated in this empty void, waiting for something, anything, to change. He couldn't tell if he was still alive or if he had already passed into some kind of nightmare, suspended between the realms of the living and the dead. The line between them had blurred, dissolved completely. And then, Just as David was on the verge of losing himself entirely, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a small ripple in the darkness, a faint flicker of movement. Then it grew. The air, if it could even be called that, began to hum with an unnatural energy. The water around him stirred. The hunger that had once been oppressive and all-consuming now seemed to retreat, just for a moment, as if something was breaking through. David's mind snapped to attention. He wasn't alone. There was something else here, something lurking beneath the surface of the lake. He could feel it, a presence that was not the lake itself, but something that existed within it, something older, darker, more ancient than anything he had ever encountered. Who are you?" David whispered, his voice hoarse, a faint tremor of hope creeping into his thoughts. The darkness around him seemed to pulse in response. The air thickened, and the water swirled in unnatural patterns, coiling around him like tendrils. Then, from the depths of the darkness, came a sound, a voice, not the same cold, hollow whisper of the lake, but something different. It was soft, almost melodic, and yet impossibly deep, as though it resonated with a force older than the earth itself. "I am the Forgotten One," the voice rumbled, reverberating through the water, through David's mind. "I am the keeper of the depths. I am the one who slumbers while the lake feeds." David's chest tightened. Something about the voice seemed familiar, yet alien. The words carried a weight, as if they were not meant for human ears, and they shook him to the core. The lake was vast, an endless expanse of water that stretched further than the eye could see. But beneath that surface, beneath the layers of forgotten souls and endless whispers, there was something older, something darker. "I am the one who has seen the end of time," the voice continued, "and the beginning of all things. I am the keeper of the secret that lies beneath the lake." David's mind reeled. A secret? What secret? Was there something more to the lake than he had ever known? Was this what the lake had been hiding all along? The voice grew louder, as if responding to his unspoken thoughts. "You are not the first to fall into its depths, David, and you will not be the last. The lake is a living thing, a force of nature. It feeds, it grows, it waits, but it is not its own master. It is bound by a darker power, a power that has been forgotten for millennia." David's heart raced. The lake, something more than just a body of water, something darker than he had ever imagined. He felt the weight of the voice, of the presence surrounding him, and for the first time since he had fallen into the depths, he understood the true horror of it all. The lake wasn't just a curse, it was a prison. "The lake has always been here," the voice continued, "but it was never meant to be. It was created by a force that lies beyond your comprehension, beyond your understanding. It is a door, a gateway, and you, David, you are the key." David's mind spun. A gateway to what, and how was he the key? "The time is coming," the voice whispered, "when the lake will open its mouth and swallow the world whole. It will spread, it will consume, it will become everything. The hunger will reach beyond these shores, beyond the land you know, and you, David, will help bring it to light." David's heart stopped. He felt his breath catch in his throat. This was what the lake had wanted all along. It wasn't just about feeding. It wasn't just about claiming souls. It had a purpose, a goal. The lake was a part of something much larger, something far more terrifying, and David had been chosen to play a role in its awakening. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed. "You will never escape. You are part of it now. The hunger is in your blood. It is in your soul. You are one with the lake." David's mind felt as though it was being torn apart, his thoughts crashing against each other like waves against jagged rocks. He had never wanted this. He had never chosen this. But now it was too late. The lake had claimed him. It had fed on his fear, his soul, and it had transformed him into something part of its endless cycle. And yet, somewhere deep within him, David could feel a flicker of resistance, a small spark of defiance. The voice, the presence, the hunger, they wanted him to believe that he was helpless, that there was no escape. But David had fought before. He had stood against the lake before. This was not over. He wouldn't let it be over. As the darkness closed in around him, as the voices of the lake's victims echoed in his mind, David made a choice. He would fight. David's mind raced, a maelstrom of thoughts, fear, and defiance. His body may have been trapped in the depths of the lake, surrounded by its suffocating grip, but his will was still his own. The lake had tried to break him, to drag him down into its endless hunger, but there was something deep inside him that refused to give in. The voice, the ancient presence, seemed to sense his resistance. It grew louder, more insistent, as if it were trying to crush him under the weight of its power. "You cannot escape, David. You belong to me. You are mine. You will do as I say." The darkness around him swirled, becoming a tangible force, pushing against him like a wall. The air was thick with the weight of the lake's presence, the water pressing against him from all sides. It felt as though the very fabric of his existence was being torn apart, each heartbeat a painful reminder of how trapped he was. But despite it all, David's mind began to clear. His breath, though shallow, was steady. He focused on the one thing that had kept him going all this time, his defiance. The lake, whatever it was, could not break him. Not completely. Not as long as he remembered who he was. "I will never be yours," David whispered to the darkness, his voice low but steady, a quiet declaration that seemed to ripple through the oppressive silence surrounding him. For a moment, there was nothing. The lake's voice faltered, as if uncertain. David could feel the shift. The pressure around him eased slightly, just enough for him to draw in a deep breath. "You're wrong," David continued, his voice growing stronger with every word, every syllable. "I am not yours. I am not a part of this. I will not be consumed by your hunger." The silence stretched on, and then, as if sensing the change within him, the voice in the darkness responded, its tone colder, more threatening. "You do not understand, David. You cannot fight what you are." The water around him began to move again, swirling violently. David could feel the current pulling at him, trying to drag him deeper into the abyss, but he pushed against it. He gritted his teeth and planted his feet, forcing himself to stand firm, even as the very ground beneath him trembled. "The lake has always been in you," the voice hissed. "The hunger is part of your soul. You will never escape." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the coldness of the water seeping into his very bones, but he wouldn't let it consume him. He wouldn't let it win. "You're wrong," he said again, his voice steady now. "I'm not a part of you. I never was." The presence faltered, and David felt a brief moment of peace, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. The whispers, the voices, the lake's hunger. They were still there, but now they seemed distant, like a shadow retreating into the corners of his mind. The pressure, the weight, the suffocating presence, all of it seemed to pull back for just an instant. And that was all David needed. With everything he had, he pushed back against the darkness. He pushed against the pull of the lake. It wasn't just his body that fought. It was his very will, his very soul, reaching out for something beyond the lake's grasp. A flicker of defiance. A spark of humanity that refused to be consumed. For a moment, he wasn't just David, the man who had fought against the pull of the lake. He was something more. Something beyond the lake's reach. He felt the hunger, the darkness, trying to drag him under, but he fought it with everything he had. He was not a part of this cycle. He was not a tool to be used by the lake's insatiable hunger. He was free. You cannot break the cycle, the voice screamed now, frantic. It will always come back. It will never end. David's heart pounded in his chest, but now his pulse felt like a drumbeat, a steady rhythm that pushed him forward. He could feel the darkness retreating, just a little, the coldness lifting. The lake's power was weakening. "You're wrong," he said one final time. "I am not your prisoner." With a roar that shook the very air around him, David surged forward, breaking through the dark waters that had threatened to swallow him whole. The pressure lifted completely, and he felt himself rising out of the depths, out of the lake's suffocating grip. The voices screamed, but they were growing fainter, softer, as if they were being pulled back into the abyss. The hunger, the endless pull, all of it was receding. David wasn't sure how, but he knew this was his chance. He broke through the surface of the water, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion. He was free. He had escaped. The world around him began to take shape again. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the soft chirping of insects, the distant hum of life beyond the water. He was back. He was free. But as he looked around, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The water, the lake, was still there. It was still watching him. And in the distance, beyond the shore, David saw something that chilled him to the core. A figure stood in the shadows, watching him with glowing eyes. It was not the figure from before, not the one that had haunted him in the depths. No, this figure was different. It was familiar. It was him. David's reflection, twisted and distorted, standing at the edge of the lake, just beyond reach. "You cannot escape," the voice echoed in his mind again, this time more insistent than ever. "The lake is in you, and it always will be." David stood there, breathless, staring at his own reflection. The lake had claimed him once. It had tried to break him. But as he stood there, looking into his own eyes, he realized something. Something that terrified him more than anything else. The cycle wasn't over. It would never be over, because he was the cycle now, and he would always return to the lake. It had him, forever. David's pulse raced as his reflection stared back at him from the dark waters. His face twisted into something unrecognizable, something wrong. The familiar eyes that had once been his own were now hollow, empty, devoid of the humanity that had defined him. His skin appeared slick with water, though he was no longer submerged. The sight of his own image, distorted by the lake's curse, sent a chill deep into his bones. He could feel the pulse of the lake beneath his feet, as though it were alive, waiting, watching. It wasn't just the water itself. It was something older, something deeper, hidden beneath the surface, buried in the very earth. The lake was not just a body of water. It was a prison, a force, and now it seemed a part of him. David understood that the cycle, the unending torment he had just escaped, was not an isolated event. It was a repeating force that could not be outrun. David took a step back, but it felt as if the ground beneath him was unstable, soft, almost like the ground was still water, still pulling at him, trying to reclaim him. The wind blew across the shore, rustling the trees, but it carried with it a sense of something waiting. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. You cannot fight it, the voice rumbled from the depths, echoing in his mind. You belong to me now. I am in you. I will never let you go. His hands clenched into fists. He had been free for a moment, a fleeting second of hope, but now he understood the truth. The lake would always find a way to drag him back. It would always pull him under, no matter how far he ran. The hunger, it was in him now. There was no escaping it. And that was the true horror, the realization that he was bound to the lake forever. Forever. David turned away from the water, refusing to look at his reflection anymore. But the feeling in his chest, the cold emptiness, was still there. He could still feel the lake's influence crawling beneath his skin, the hunger in his bones. He was not whole anymore. He wasn't the same man who had first stumbled into the woods. He was something else now. Something twisted. You are not alone, the voice whispered, soft and insistent. There are others. Others who have been claimed. Others who walk the shore, just like you. They are waiting. David froze, his heart beating in his throat. He didn't know who or what the voice was talking about, but he felt a presence, other presences, gathering around him. The wind shifted, and the rustling of the trees became louder, more frantic, as though something was moving within the shadows. He turned to the woods behind him, his breath shallow. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the lake, shapes moved among the trees. Faint figures, shadowy, indistinct, seemed to be watching him, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The same red eyes he had seen in the depths, the same hollow gaze of the figures who had once dragged him under, now standing in the distance, waiting for him. The figures began to move closer, slow and deliberate. David's heart skipped a beat, a wave of panic surging through him. Were they the lost souls of those who had come before him? Had the lake taken others, trapping them in this cursed cycle just like him? They are waiting for you, David, the voice called, louder now, surrounding him, filling his mind. They have been here longer than you, longer than anyone, and they will never leave. The figures began to take shape, their forms becoming clearer in the moonlight. They were humanoid, tall, thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Their faces were like masks, expressionless, but their eyes, those glowing red eyes, stared directly at him. They were like him now, like his reflection, distorted by the lake's power. David stepped back, his breath quickening. He could hear them now, the whispers of the others, speaking in unison, their voices a low murmur that sent shivers down his spine. Come back, they whispered, each word stretching out into the night air. Come back to the lake. You cannot escape. We are all one with it now. David's pulse pounded in his ears, his every instinct screaming for him to run. But his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot, as if the very earth beneath him had become a part of the lake, pulling him in. The figures were getting closer, their long limbs moving in eerie synchronization, their steps silent but sure. David could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their hunger, as though the very air around him was charged with their shared desire to pull him under again. "You can't fight us," one of the figures said, its voice chillingly calm. It stepped closer, its eyes glowing brighter in the moonlight. "You are one of us now. We are the lost. We are the forgotten. We are the lake." David's heart lurched in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He had escaped once, but now the lake's reach was endless. It stretched beyond the water, beyond the forest. It had claimed so many before him, and now it was claiming him again. But something deep inside him stirred. A spark, small but persistent, still burned in the depths of his soul. The hunger, the cold, the twisted shadow that had taken root within him. It was not who he was. It was what the lake had made him, but it was not his identity. He remembered the fight, the struggle, the defiance. David's mind screamed with the desire to break free, to not become like them. He would not be another lost soul, wandering in the darkness forever. He would fight this. "You are not me," David growled, his voice trembling with fury. "You will never be me." And with that, something inside him snapped. A rush of energy surged through him, like a torrent breaking free from a dam. He could feel the lake's influence, its grip, start to weaken as he pushed back. It was not just physical strength. It was willpower, the defiance of his spirit, the refusal to give in. For the first time since the lake had claimed him, David felt like he could fight back, not just against the lake, but against what he had become. The figures paused, their glowing red eyes narrowing, their forms flickering in and out of focus. The whispers slowed, but they did not stop. The hunger remained, but David felt something break within the shadows around him. The lake had claimed him once, but he would not let it claim him again. He was not its prisoner. He was not one of them. David stepped forward, his heart still racing, but his mind clearer than it had ever been. He was going to fight. He would never stop fighting. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the lake began to stir once more. David's breath came in short, shallow gasps, but his resolve had never been stronger. As the figures around him shifted, flickering in the pale moonlight, their eyes never leaving him, something inside him twisted. He had once been terrified of them, their presence, their whispers, their hunger. But now, there was only one thing that mattered, his will to live, his will to fight. With each breath, the weight of the lake's power seemed to press on him less, like a shadow retreating before the light. He had felt it in his bones before, its insidious pull, its endless hunger. But now, in the face of the figures closing in on him, something had awakened. The terror, the confusion, the suffocating fear. They were all still there, yes, but he had learned something crucial in his descent into the lake's depths. He was more than just the lake's victim. He was more than just its prisoner. For the first time, he understood the cycle. The lake wasn't just a place. It wasn't merely a body of water. It was a curse, an endless loop of suffering that dragged people in, chewed them up, and then spat them back out as something less, something twisted. And the others around him, the figures, had once been just like him. They had been claimed by the lake, lost to it, transformed into something other by its power. But David refused to become one of them. The hunger gnawed at him, pulling at his very soul, but he was done being afraid. He could feel the lake calling, whispering to him, trying to drag him back into its depths, but he would not go. He had learned too much. The figures, the others, they were trapped in the same cycle. They could never escape, but David could. He would break free. He had to. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to take another step forward, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The figures around him remained still, their glowing red eyes fixed on him, waiting, watching. Their faces, those cold, emotionless masks, gave nothing away, but David knew what they wanted. They wanted him to give in, to surrender to the lake's hunger, to become like them. But he refused. "You can't escape," one of them whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. It was closer now, its skeletal frame looming over him, its face unreadable. But its eyes were burning with a cold, hungry light. "You will join us. You will become one of us. And then the cycle will be complete." David felt a surge of fury flood through him, hotter than anything the lake could ever offer. He was not one of them. He would never be one of them. He was not a prisoner. He was not a tool of the lake's insatiable hunger. He was a man who would fight for his soul, for his freedom. And as long as he drew breath, the lake would never claim him. "No," he muttered, his voice low and steady. "I will not be your prisoner. I will not become like you." For a moment, there was silence. The wind seemed to still. The figures did not move, their eyes burning into him. But David did not look away. His body trembled, yes, but he stood firm. His breath steadied, and the hunger, that gnawing sensation deep within him, seemed to fade, just for a moment. The silence was broken by a voice that seemed to come from the very earth itself, deep and resonant. "You cannot fight what is inside you, David. The lake is a part of you. It always has been. You cannot escape." The ground beneath David's feet trembled, as though the lake itself were reaching out, trying to drag him under. The water around the shore surged, rising up in twisting tendrils, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him toward the darkness. His body screamed for him to run, but he stood his ground, resisting with every ounce of strength he had left. "You belong to the lake. You will always return. Always." The figures began to move again, their steps slow but deliberate. They circled him, their long, spindly arms reaching out toward him, their eyes never leaving his face. David could feel their gaze burrowing into him, their presence suffocating. They wanted him. They wanted him to join them in the abyss. They wanted him to give in, to surrender to the hunger. David closed his eyes, his chest heaving as the weight of the lake's power pressed down on him. The darkness crept in at the edges of his mind, the lake's whispers curling around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. But in the center of his mind, there was a flame, a flicker of defiance, of rage, of freedom. He clenched his fists, the bones of his hands creaking under the pressure. "No," he whispered again, this time with more conviction. "I will not be your prisoner. I will break free." And then something shifted. The lake roared in fury, its power thrashing against him like a beast enraged, desperate to pull him back into its depths. The water around him rose higher, faster, until it was swirling around him like a whirlpool, threatening to drag him under once more. The figures closed in, their faces contorted with hunger and malice. But David stood tall. With a final, desperate cry, he pushed forward, breaking through the circle of figures. His heart pounded in his chest, but he did not stop. He couldn't stop. He reached out, feeling the edge of the lake's grasp just within his reach. And in that moment, he felt it. The tug of something more, something greater than the lake's power. It was the pull of the land, of life, of freedom. He could feel the earth beneath his feet, solid and real, the warmth of the world beyond the lake calling to him. He could hear the faint whispers of birds in the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant sound of a world that had not yet fallen under the lake's curse. He was not alone. There were still others beyond this place, and he would find them. He could feel the cycle, the curse, breaking. The lake's grip was weakening, its power dissipating. It was as if, for the first time, David had found the strength to escape. The figures howled in anger, but their voices began to fade, their forms flickering in and out of existence. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, retreating back into the lake from which they had emerged. And then there was silence. David stood at the edge of the water, his heart racing in his chest, but a sense of peace settling over him. The lake was no longer the all-consuming force it had once been. The hunger, the darkness, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but now it felt distant, weakened. He could feel the echoes of the lake's power, but they no longer had a hold on him. David had broken free. He turned his back on the water, the figures, the whispers, and walked toward the trees, toward the distant light of the world beyond. The lake would never truly be gone, but David had learned the truth. No matter how deep the darkness, no matter how endless the cycle, there was always a way out. And for the first time in what felt like forever, David was free. It was late autumn when Peter first noticed the figure in the trees. He had always loved the woods behind his house, the old growth towering above him like sentinels, their leaves whispering in the wind, their roots entwined deep within the earth. They were a place of peace, a sanctuary of solitude. But lately, the woods had begun to feel different, unsettling, as though they were watching him. It was an ordinary evening when it happened. The sky had darkened early, as it did this time of year, and the last rays of sunlight had just disappeared behind the horizon. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Peter was walking along the well-worn path, his boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, perhaps, cast by one of the trees. But as he stepped closer, the shadow remained, unnaturally still, unervingly tall. He squinted, and there, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure, a man, or what looked like a man, standing perfectly still, just out of reach of the dying light. His face was obscured by a dark hood, and his hands were tucked into the folds of his cloak. There was no movement, no sign of life, just a figure, standing motionless, staring into the woods with an empty gaze. Peter felt a shiver creep up his spine. The woods were never empty at night. There were always creatures rustling in the underbrush, or the wind playing tricks through the branches. But this man, this thing, didn't belong here. He should have turned and run back home. But instead, his feet carried him forward, against his better judgment. It was as if some unseen force was pulling him toward the figure, urging him to move closer. With each step, the hairs on his neck stood up. The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. Peter stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes locked onto the figure's hood, trying to see beneath it. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the figure spoke. "Come closer." Peter froze. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard any movement, no rustling of leaves, no shift in the air to indicate the figure had spoken. The voice seemed to seep into his mind, chilling him to his core. "Come closer, Peter." The name, his name, was enough to break his trance. He spun on his heel, his legs propelling him backward with a sudden urgency. His heart raced as he stumbled down the path, the sound of his feet thundering in his ears. But when he glanced over his shoulder, the figure was gone. The woods were silent once more. Peter didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his house, slamming the door behind him and bolting it shut. His hands trembled as he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. But his mind raced. The image of the figure seared into his memory. He had never been one for superstitions, but there was something about that encounter that felt wrong, something that felt deeply unnatural, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn for just a moment, and he had glimpsed something on the other side. Later that night, Peter tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to fatigue or the onset of the colder months playing tricks on his mind. But as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, he found himself unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the figure, whatever it had been, was still watching him. It was just after midnight when he heard the knock. It was faint at first, a soft rapping at the door that made his pulse quicken. He stood frozen for a moment, listening, his heart in his throat. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. Peter's breath hitched. He knew it wasn't a neighbor. He knew that nobody would be out there in the middle of the night, knocking on his door, especially not after what had happened earlier. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't just a knock. It was something else, something wrong. A slow, deliberate scratching sound followed, like fingernails dragging across wood. The sound scraped down the door, each stroke sending a cold shiver through Peter's body. He backed away, his mind reeling. What was happening? Who or what was out there? And then the voice came again, low and distorted, as though it had been twisted by some unseen force. "I see you, Peter." The words felt like ice. They sank into his bones, freezing him in place. There was no mistaking it now. The figure from the woods, the hollow man, was here. It had followed him home. It knew his name. "Come out," the voice whispered, now closer, almost like a breath against the door. "Come out and see me." Peter's mind raced. There was no way out, no escape from the darkness that was creeping in around him. The walls of the house felt suffocating, like the very air had grown thick, pressing in on him. With trembling hands, he grabbed his phone from the table, dialing 911. The phone rang once, twice. Then there was a click. A soft, raspy breath echoed from the other end. "Hello, Peter." Peter's heart skipped a beat. His throat went dry. "You shouldn't have called." The voice was different now. There was no distortion, no echo. It was the same voice, but it was no longer a whisper. It was clear, cold, and completely devoid of any human warmth. Peter dropped the phone in horror, the reality of the situation dawning on him. The walls of the room began to close in, the air growing heavier. He was no longer alone. The figure was here. And it wasn't just watching him anymore. The floorboards creaked behind him. Slowly, Peter turned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the Hollow Man. His face, hidden beneath the dark hood, was a void, an emptiness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. "You invited me in, Peter," the figure intoned, its voice low and haunting. "And now you are mine." Peter tried to scream, but no sound came. His limbs felt heavy, like lead, his entire body frozen in terror as the figure stepped closer, the darkness around it consuming everything in its path. The Hollow Man reached out with one long, skeletal hand, and Peter's vision blurred. He was being pulled in, dragged toward the emptiness of the figure's gaze. And then there was nothing. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Neighbors whispered about the strange disappearance of Peter, the man who had lived alone, whose door had been found wide open, but who had never been seen again. Some say the woods still watch, that the Hollow Man still wanders among the trees, waiting for the next soul to come too close. And some say that if you listen carefully on a dark night, you can hear his voice calling your name. The town had almost forgotten about Peter. People come and go, life moves on, and the shadows of the past fade with time. But there were still those who whispered, who remembered the strange events of that night, and who could never quite shake the feeling that something was wrong, something unfinished. It had been 3 weeks since Peter disappeared, and while the police had scoured the woods and questioned anyone who might have seen something, nothing had been found. No body, no clues, just an empty house, a door left wide open, and a phone lying on the floor with its screen cracked and smeared in something that looked like dirt. But tonight, the air felt different. The wind had picked up in the early evening, rattling the trees and carrying a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of those who dared venture outside. It was the kind of night when the shadows felt thicker, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. And in the woods, just beyond the town's edge, something was stirring. A woman named Emily, a friend of Peter's from childhood, had never quite accepted his disappearance. Something inside her told her that the police hadn't looked hard enough, that there was something more to his vanishing than they cared to admit. She had spent the last few days researching, digging through old town records, speaking to people who had lived in the area long before she had arrived. What she found was unsettling. The town had a history, a long, dark history, of strange disappearances, of people who had vanished without a trace, and they always involved the woods. Tonight, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Peter's story was far from over. Something about the way the wind howled, about the eerie stillness in the air, told her that there was more to this mystery. And if she didn't find out the truth, it would haunt her for the rest of her life. With a flashlight in hand and a deep sense of dread settling in her gut, Emily stepped into the woods. She knew the path well enough, having walked it countless times with Peter as children, but tonight it felt different. The trees loomed taller than usual, their twisted branches stretching like arms reaching out to grab her. The path she had once walked with ease now seemed to twist and change, the shadows moving in ways that didn't seem natural. Emily walked for what felt like hours, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. No animals scurried through the underbrush. No leaves rustled in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And then, just as she was beginning to think that maybe she had made a mistake, she saw something. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam, hidden among the trees. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. The figure was tall, cloaked in dark rags that fluttered in the wind, its face obscured by the shadows of the forest. But there was something wrong about it. The way it stood so still, the way it seemed to watch her without moving. "Peter," she whispered, her voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Just as she was about to turn and leave, a voice, soft, chilling, came from the shadows. Emily. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Peter's voice, but there was something wrong with it. It was distorted, like it had been twisted through a filter, distant, as though it were coming from deep within the earth itself. "Emily, I've been waiting for you." Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. But the voice was still there, echoing around her. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have come looking for me." Suddenly, the air around her grew colder. A frigid chill ran through her bones, and she felt the presence of something ancient, something evil closing in on her. "You're not the first," the voice continued, now clearer, but still unnatural, "and you won't be the last." Emily scrambled to her feet, panic surging through her. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to escape before whatever this was, this thing in the woods, claimed her too. But her body felt paralyzed, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the trees closing in around her. And then a figure stepped into the light. It was him, or what was left of him, Peter's body. No, something that looked like Peter stood before her. His face was pale, his skin stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and sunken. There were no words for the emptiness that stared back at her. His mouth hung open in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged, like the fangs of some predatory creature. The hollow man had returned. "Do you see me now?" the figure asked, its voice now twisted and guttural, like the cracking of bones. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away, stumbling over roots and rocks, her breath coming in short gasps. She could feel it. He was not the same. Peter was gone, lost to whatever had claimed him, and now he was something else, something worse. The hollow man took a slow step forward, his fingers twitching like they were eager to reach out for her, to drag her into the same fate that had befallen Peter. The darkness around them thickened, the shadows growing longer and deeper, until the light of the moon barely reached the ground. "You can't escape, Emily," he whispered, his voice now full of something that sounded like hunger. The woods never let go. Terror coursed through her, but Emily found the strength to turn and run, her heart pounding in her ears, the sound of her breath like thunder in the silence. But the woods were no longer the woods she had known. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their gnarled branches reaching out like hands, trying to catch her, to pull her back into the dark. The hollow man was close now, his footsteps echoing behind her, his voice chasing her through the suffocating darkness. "Come back, Emily," it called. "You belong here. You will be one of us." She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exhaustion, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, but the woods felt endless. The path she once knew so well seemed to twist, to stretch, until she had no idea which way she was going. Then, ahead of her, she saw it. The clearing. She could see the moonlight breaking through the trees, a glimpse of the safety beyond the woods. With one final burst of strength, Emily ran toward the clearing, but as her foot hit the ground, a cold hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing her by the ankle. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. The hollow man's voice echoed in her mind, whispering once more, "You will never leave." And then everything went dark. The silence was deafening. Emily's mind swirled in darkness, her senses disoriented, as though she were trapped in a place between worlds. She felt her body suspended in nothingness, the ground gone beneath her feet, her breath shallow and ragged. She couldn't remember when she'd last been able to move. Time itself seemed to stretch into an endless abyss. But then, something stirred. It was faint at first, a whisper in the wind, a faint rustling sound as if someone was brushing against the leaves. But it was more than that. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of her presence, watching her. The trees loomed large around her, their twisted branches stretching out like grasping hands, and a cold wind blew through, carrying with it a scent she couldn't place. It wasn't the fresh earthiness of the woods. No, this scent was decay. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. She gasped, her body jerking upright. The world around her was no longer the familiar woods she had entered. This was something else. The trees had twisted into grotesque shapes, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, their leaves blackened and withered. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, cracked, as though the very earth had been torn apart. She stood alone in the clearing, but she could sense it. They were all around her, watching. And then she heard it, the voice. "Welcome back." Emily spun, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with fear. The hollow man stood before her, his twisted figure now fully visible, towering over her with that hollow, empty gaze. His features, once a distortion of Peter's face, were now completely blank. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were nothing more than black voids. "You shouldn't have come back." His voice was cold, filled with an unholy authority that sent chills down her spine. "The woods have claimed you. You are part of this now." Emily took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt the pull of the forest around her, its oppressive weight sinking into her bones. There was no escape. The woods, the hollow man, they were all part of the curse of the forest that had claimed Peter, and now it was claiming her, too. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone, her body refusing to obey her commands. She was trapped. "You should have listened," the hollow man continued, his voice softer now, almost soothing. "You should have stayed away. Now you will understand. You will become one of us." Emily could feel it, the darkness pressing in on her, curling around her like a tightening noose. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, a force of nature that fed on fear, on the souls of those who ventured too close. And now she was part of its twisted cycle. But even as the hollow man reached for her, something stirred inside her, a small, flickering light of defiance. She wasn't going to let him take her without a fight. She refused to be another lost soul in this nightmare. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, Emily turned and ran. Her legs burned with each step, but she forced herself to move faster, her vision blurring as she sprinted through the twisted trees. The hollow man's voice echoed behind her, growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape." But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. She had to get out of the woods, no matter the cost. The ground beneath her feet became uneven, the roots reaching up like hands, trying to trip her, to pull her back into the earth. She stumbled, but managed to keep running. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Then, just as she thought she couldn't go any farther, she saw it, a small, faint light in the distance. The edge of the woods, the boundary between the forest and the outside world. She pushed herself harder, her breath ragged, her body screaming for rest, but she kept moving. The light grew brighter, and with it, a surge of hope. She was almost there, almost free, but then the ground gave way beneath her. With a cry, Emily fell to the ground, the world spinning around her. She landed hard, her body jolting with pain. Dazed, she tried to push herself up, but something was wrong. The air was thick, almost tangible. It pressed against her, pulling her back into the darkness. She looked around and gasped. The woods were closing in. The trees had grown taller, their branches reaching down like claws, blocking out the light. The clearing, the one place she thought was her escape, was gone. She was back at the beginning. The hollow man stood in front of her, his empty gaze locking with hers. His face was a mask of cold indifference, as though he were watching a helpless animal trapped in a cage. "You will never leave," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "None of us do." The forest around her seemed to breathe. The trees whispered, their voices blending into a symphony of hushed tones. Emily could hear them now. The others, the souls that had been claimed by the woods. Their voices mingled with the wind, their pleas for release lost in the murmur of the leaves. "Join us," the hollow man whispered, his hand reaching out to her. "You belong here now, forever." Emily fought the urge to give in. She had seen what happened to Peter, to those who had wandered into the woods and never returned. They became part of the forest, trapped in its endless cycle. The hollow man wasn't just a creature of the woods. He was its keeper, its master, and he was never alone. With every ounce of strength left in her, Emily pushed herself to her feet. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. She would find a way out. She had to. But as she turned to run, the forest seemed to shift, to warp around her. The trees closed in, the path becoming a maze. No matter which direction she ran, she only seemed to circle back to the clearing. The hollow man's presence was suffocating, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. And then, the whispering voices grew louder. "You can't fight it," they murmured in unison. "We are the forest. We are eternal." With each step she took, Emily felt her strength slipping away. The woods were no longer just trees. They were alive. They were watching her, waiting for her to give in. As the hollow man's shadow loomed over her, she realized there was no escape. Not for her. Not for Peter. Not for anyone who had dared to venture too close. The forest would claim her, just as it had claimed them all. And in the darkness, Emily understood, the woods would never let her go. In the end, the hollow man always wins. Emily's body trembled as the hollow man drew nearer. The air around her felt thick with dread, as though every breath she took was laced with the scent of death. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but the forest, no, the woods, had already ensnared her. It wrapped its tendrils around her mind, her body, her very soul, until she was paralyzed, lost in its depths. The whispers of the lost souls around her grew louder, their voices a chorus of suffering, repeating the same words over and over again. "You can't escape. Join us." We are the forest. We are eternal. The hollow man's eyes, two black voids in his twisted face, locked with hers. There was no emotion in them, no mercy, only an empty promise of eternal torment. The pale rags that draped his body fluttered in the wind, but they didn't make a sound. He was the silence in the night, the stillness that crushed every ounce of resistance within her. "You're not the first," the hollow man whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves, hollow and cold. "But you will be the last." Emily's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. The weight of the forest pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, every inch of her being screaming for release. The voices of the lost souls echoed in her ears, and she could almost hear their stories. Stories of people who had come here long ago, seeking answers, seeking freedom, but finding only a twisted fate. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like her mind was going to split in two. "Peter?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. The hollow man, the thing that had taken Peter, was now a part of the forest, and soon she would be too. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes snapped open as the wood seemed to shift, the trees groaning as if in pain. The hollow man stepped back, his form blurring as though it were being swallowed by the shadows. And then a voice, different from the hollow man's, called out from the distance. "Emily." It was Peter's voice. Her pulse quickened, hope sparking for the briefest moment. Could it be? Could Peter somehow be alive, somehow still in there? Could he be calling to her for help? "Peter," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She strained to see, to make sense of what was happening, but the darkness was consuming everything. "Emily," the voice called again, this time louder, more desperate. "You have to run. Now." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but the urgency in Peter's voice was unmistakable. She had to move. She had to get out. She pushed herself up, ignoring the pain in her limbs, ignoring the pull of the forest that was trying to drag her back down. She didn't look at the hollow man, didn't listen to his whispers. She turned toward the voice, toward the sound of Peter calling her. She ran. The forest was a blur around her as she sprinted, her feet stumbling over rocks and roots. The trees seemed to warp and twist, their branches reaching out to grab her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The voice was guiding her, pulling her forward, and every step she took felt like it might be her last, but she didn't care. She had to trust it. She had to trust that there was a way out. The air was thick with an unnatural fog now, and the ground was slick with something dark and wet. The cold wrapped around her like an icy hand, but she didn't slow. She had to keep running. "Emily." Peter's voice was louder now, closer. She could feel it, could feel him there, but where was he? What was happening? And then, suddenly, everything went silent. The wind stopped. The whispers ceased. The world around her fell still, as though time had frozen in place. Emily stumbled to a stop, her heart racing. She looked around, the silence deafening. And then she saw him, Peter. But he wasn't right. His once familiar face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, like the hollow man's, but his expression was one of pain. His body seemed twisted, like he had been pulled through 1,000 years of torment, his limbs hanging loosely by his sides. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his gaze fixed on her, a look of sadness in his eyes that made her stomach turn. "Peter," she whispered, her voice trembling. What happened to you?" Peter opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was the hollow man's voice, cold and echoing with the weight of something ancient. "She's here," the hollow man whispered through Peter's lips, his mouth twisting into a sickening grin. "You found her." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her heart sank as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Peter was gone. Whatever stood before her now was just a shell, a puppet controlled by the malevolent force of the woods. The hollow man had claimed him, and now it was claiming her. "You can't escape, Emily," the hollow man's voice echoed. "None of you ever do." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the world around her began to warp. The trees closed in, their branches twisting like fingers, the darkness thickening, suffocating her. She looked around, but all she saw was the void, the endless black, and the hollow man's twisted smile as he stepped toward her. "You belong to the forest now," the hollow man said, his voice soft, almost affectionate. "You'll never leave. You'll never see the light again." Emily's body trembled. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the darkness was already consuming her. She could feel it, feel her soul being pulled deeper and deeper into the void. She wasn't just trapped in the woods. She was being absorbed into it, becoming part of it. And as the last of the light faded from her eyes, Emily understood the truth. The forest didn't just take lives, it claimed them. And now, she would become another part of its endless, cursed cycle. And so, the hollow man's grip tightened, and the forest grew darker still. The forest was silent, but it was a silence that felt alive, as though every leaf, every twig, every shadow was watching her. Emily could feel herself fading, her thoughts slowing, her heart no longer racing with the fear that once consumed her. The hollow man, Peter, or whatever remained of him, stood before her, his hollow eyes locked onto hers, cold and empty. She tried to scream, to push him away, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the suffocating darkness of the woods. Her limbs felt heavy, as though the very ground was pulling her down into it, into the earth itself. She was losing herself, piece by piece, to the curse of the forest. "You're one of us now," the hollow man said softly, his voice no longer cruel, but oddly comforting, as if he were offering her a twisted form of peace. "There is no escape." But Emily couldn't accept it. She refused to let the forest claim her, not without a fight. No matter how lost she felt, how helpless the world around her seemed, she couldn't just surrender. She had to hold on to something, anything. She closed her eyes and thought of Peter, of the boy she had known, the boy who had once been full of life and laughter before the darkness had claimed him. She remembered his smile, his warmth, and the love they had shared. She couldn't forget him. Not now, not ever. Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time since entering the woods, Emily felt a spark of strength deep within her, a sense of purpose. She wouldn't let the hollow man take her. Not like this. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible but full of defiance. "I won't become part of you." The hollow man tilted his head, an almost curious expression crossing his featureless face. The trees seemed to tremble with the weight of her words, the air itself heavy with anticipation. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, but Emily stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was no longer the helpless girl who had wandered into this nightmare. She was stronger than that. stronger than the curse that had sought to claim her. And then something changed. A crack appeared in the dark sky above, a tiny sliver of light breaking through the thick, oppressive clouds. It was small at first, but it grew, widening as the wind began to stir, brushing the dead leaves of the forest with a new energy. The hollow man's expression faltered, his empty gaze flickering for the briefest moment. "No," he growled, his voice growing louder, more furious. "You cannot escape. You belong to the woods." But Emily felt it then, a surge of power, of life, that came not from her own strength, but from the forest itself. The very forest that had sought to consume her was now turning against the hollow man. The darkness that had wrapped around her like a vice now seemed to recoil, as if afraid of the light that was growing stronger. She didn't know how, but she understood. The forest was alive, yes, but it wasn't just malevolent. It was a part of something greater, something ancient, and it was fighting the curse, the hollow man's control. "This is not your forest anymore," Emily whispered, her voice gaining strength. "This is my escape." With one final, desperate cry, she threw herself toward the light. The hollow man reached out to stop her, but the trees around him shifted, their branches snapping and twisting, holding him back. The darkness writhed and screamed, but Emily didn't look back. She focused only on the light, the path that was opening up before her. As she reached the edge of the woods, she felt the pull of the forest weakening. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt like it was sinking into the earth. The cold, suffocating air lifted, replaced by a breeze that was warm, alive. And with one final step, Emily crossed the threshold of the forest. The moment she left the woods, the world around her changed. The trees no longer twisted and writhed. They stood still, peaceful, as if the curse had lifted. The forest no longer seemed like a prison. It was just a forest again. Emily fell to her knees, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She was free, but in the distance, just beyond the trees, something stirred. A shadow in the shape of a man, standing just out of reach. His figure was tall, thin, and it was then that Emily realized the hollow man had not been defeated. He was still there, watching, waiting. But he was no longer the forest's master. The curse was broken, for now. But the hollow man, he was a part of the forest, an ancient evil that would never truly disappear. With one last look at the woods, Emily stood and turned away. She walked into the daylight, the world outside the forest stretching before her like a promise of freedom. But she knew one thing for sure: the forest's curse was still there, somewhere. It would wait. It would always wait for the next lost soul who wandered too close. And the hollow man, the keeper of the woods, would never stop hunting. But Emily was free, for now, and that was enough. The end. Her heart skipped a beat, but as the figure drew closer, she saw that it wasn't him. It was something else, something dark. The forest wasn't done with her yet. Rachel turned, her breath quickening as the shadows of the woods closed in around her once more. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.